There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a soldier the night before everything changes. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest. It is the silence of a man staring at a ceiling he may never see again, running through the mathematics of survival, wondering whether the training, the long Atlantic crossing, the months of mud and maneuver, whether any of it was enough. Multiply that silence by tens of thousands of men scattered across the dark fields of southern England, and you begin to feel the weight of what the United States First Army carried into the summer of 1944. This is not a story about a single battle, or a single general, or a single day of glory. This is the complete history of an army, one that was born in paperwork and administrative reshuffling, that grew up in the swamps and pine forests of the American South, that crossed a submarine-haunted ocean with nothing guaranteed on the other side, and that spent the next year carving a path through some of the most brutal fighting the modern world had ever produced. From the Norman hedgerows to the banks of the Rhine, from the frozen shock of the Ardennes to the surreal quiet of a destroyed Germany in spring, the First Army was there for nearly all of it, and the story of how it got there, and what it cost, deserves to be told in full. You may know fragments of this story. Most people do. The name Omaha Beach carries a weight that needs no explanation. The Battle of the Bulge is taught in schools. The image of American and Soviet soldiers clasping hands across a river somewhere in the heart of a broken Germany has become one of the defining photographs of the 20th century. But knowing fragments is not the same as understanding the whole, and the whole is something else entirely. Because behind every famous photograph, behind every famous battle, behind every famous name, there were hundreds of thousands of ordinary men doing extraordinarily difficult things under conditions designed to destroy them. There were commanders making decisions in the dark with incomplete information, officers holding units together through sheer force of character, engineers bridging rivers while artillery rounds walked toward them across the water. There were soldiers who had never left their home counties suddenly navigating the bocage of Normandy, the forests of Belgium, the rubble-choked streets of German towns whose names they could barely pronounce. These men did not think of themselves as historical figures. They thought of themselves as cold, tired, and a long way from home. General Courtney Hodges, the man who would lead this army through its most consequential campaigns, was not the kind of commander who sought out the spotlight. He was precise, methodical, and demanding in ways that did not always endear him to the men above or below him. History has not always been generous to Hodges, and there are chapters of this story where the criticism aimed at him carries genuine weight. But history is complicated, and so is command, and what Hodges managed across nearly a year of continuous operations, across terrain, weather, supply failures, and a German military that refused to stop fighting even as it was clearly losing, represents a form of institutional persistence that deserves more serious attention than it usually receives. This documentary will give it that attention, all of it, the triumphs and the failures equally, the moments of breathtaking operational success and the moments of catastrophic miscalculation. The days when the First Army moved faster than any army in the history of warfare, and the days when it spent 3 weeks fighting for a patch of flooded farmland that meant almost nothing on a map, but everything to the men who died there. We are going to trace this army from its administrative birth in 1941 through the grinding education of training, across the Atlantic into the fire of Normandy, and all the way to the Elbe River in April of 1945, where soldiers who had started their war on American soil suddenly found themselves shaking hands with men who had fought their way west from Stalingrad. That is an extraordinary arc, and it belongs to an army that history often discusses only in pieces. The United States First Army is frequently overshadowed in popular memory by the drama surrounding other commands, other personalities, other theaters. Patton's Third Army captures the imagination with its speed and swagger. The airborne divisions have their own mythology, carefully cultivated and entirely earned. The Pacific Theater competes for attention with its own catalog of island assaults and naval battles. But the First Army was the spine of the American effort in Northwest Europe. It was the force that hit the beaches first. It was the force that absorbed the initial shock of the Ardennes offensive when German armor came pouring through the morning fog. It was the force that crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany when the end was finally, visibly approaching. Without the First Army holding the center, the entire Allied campaign in Western Europe looks different, slower, more fragile, more uncertain. That is the story we are here to tell. If you are new to this channel, welcome. What we do here is take the large events of military history and slow them down enough to actually understand them. Not just the famous decisions made by famous men in warm headquarters, but the conditions on the ground, the logistical realities, the human cost, and the long chain of cause and effect that connects a bureaucratic reorganization in 1941 to a handshake on the Elbe in 1945. We do not rush. We do not simplify. We treat you as someone who wants the real history, not the highlight reel. If that is the kind of content that speaks to you, take a moment right now and subscribe. It costs nothing. It keeps this work going, and it ensures you will not miss a single chapter of this series as it continues to unfold. And if you are settling in for the night, if you have found your way here in the quiet hours, looking for something long and absorbing and worth your time, then this is exactly the right place to be. 18 chapters of history, told in full, at whatever pace suits you. There is no rush. The war is over. We have the luxury of understanding it properly. Settle in, because what follows is not a simple story of heroism and victory, though there is heroism here, in quantities that are genuinely difficult to comprehend. What follows is the complete, unvarnished account of an army that was built from almost nothing, thrown into the most consequential conflict in human history, and asked to keep fighting, through heat and mud and snow and supply shortages and leadership failures and German counteroffensives, until the job was finished. They finished it. This is how. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over an institution on the verge of transformation. Not silence exactly, but something heavier, the held breath of men who sense that the world they know is about to change beyond recognition. In the years before the United States Army formally committed itself to the war already consuming Europe and the Pacific, that quiet settled over headquarters buildings and training fields from Georgia to Maine. Officers shuffled papers, clerks updated rosters. Generals attended meetings where the word reorganization appeared so frequently it began to lose meaning. And yet beneath the bureaucratic surface, something real was taking shape, something that would eventually carry hundreds of thousands of men across an ocean and into the longest, most consequential campaign in American military history. The United States Army of the early 1940s was not the force it would become. It was vast in theory, scattered in practice, and burdened by years of underinvestment that left it institutionally lean and materially thin. The nation had emerged from the Great Depression with no appetite for military expenditure, and the peacetime army reflected that reluctance in every department. Equipment was outdated or simply absent. Training doctrine had been written for a different era. The men who filled the ranks ranged from career soldiers hardened by years of service to draftees who had never worn a uniform before their induction notices arrived. Welding this collection of individuals and units into something capable of fighting a modern European war was not a problem of will, it was a problem of structure, and structure required command. The reorganization that produced the First Army did not emerge from a single decision or a single day. It was the product of months of revision, debate, and quiet pressure from officers who understood that the Army's existing command architecture was inadequate for the scale of war that was coming. Field armies, large operational formations capable of commanding multiple corps and hundreds of thousands of men, had been discussed and planned for years, but translating doctrine into functioning headquarters was another matter entirely. The Army needed not just the paper existence of the First Army, but its actual bones, the staff officers, the communications networks, the supply systems, and the command relationships that would allow it to function as a coherent fighting entity when the time came. Building those bones took time the army was not certain it had. General Courtney Hodges came to the First Army the way many officers come to great commands, not through dramatic circumstance, but through the accumulated weight of a long, disciplined career. Hodges was not a flamboyant man. He did not seek attention, did not cultivate the kind of public image that later commanders like Patton would make almost theatrical. What he possessed instead was something quieter and, in some ways, more durable. A deep, precise understanding of infantry tactics, an almost architectural patience in the face of complexity, and a professional reputation built over decades of service that commanded genuine respect from those who knew him. He had walked away from West Point as a young man, an unusual break in a military career, and had enlisted as a private, earning his commission through examination and performance rather than the academy's formal pathway. That unconventional beginning shaped him in ways that were not always visible but were always present. He understood what ordinary soldiers endured because he had been one. Inheriting the First Army meant inheriting a problem set that was as administrative as it was military. The units nominally under the First Army's authority were spread across the eastern seaboard and the American interior, training in different locations under different conditions with different levels of readiness. Coastal defense had consumed significant attention in the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, when the prospect of enemy action against American shores had briefly seemed more than theoretical. Guard posts had been established, searchlights positioned, and artillery batteries emplaced along stretches of coastline that, in calmer retrospect, were never truly threatened. The men assigned to those positions were capable soldiers tied to static roles that would teach them little about the mobile, offensive warfare they would eventually be asked to wage. Releasing them from those duties and folding them into a coherent, forward-oriented command structure was one of the early tasks the First Army faced. The training camps scattered across the American South and Northeast were, in some respects, more organized but no less challenging. The Army had expanded rapidly in response to the draft, and training installations that had been designed for smaller peacetime forces were now absorbing tens of thousands of new soldiers simultaneously. The infrastructure strained under the pressure. Barracks that should have housed 100 men housed considerably more. Ranges that had been adequate for peacetime training schedules were now booked around the clock. Instructors who might once have had months to prepare a soldier for the field now had weeks. The quality of training was uneven, and Hodges and his staff were acutely aware of it. Establishing consistent standards across formations that had grown so rapidly under so many different local conditions was precisely the kind of unglamorous institutional work that determined whether armies succeeded or failed before they ever reached a battlefield. Hodges was not alone in this effort. The First Army's early months were also a story of staff building. The slow, careful selection of officers who could translate command intent into operational reality across a headquarters that was itself still finding its shape. Staff work is not celebrated the way infantry assaults are celebrated, but it is the mechanism through which large armies move and fight. A corps commander's order is only as good as the staff officers who disseminate it, the logistics officers who calculate whether it can be sustained, and the signal officers who ensure the communications network holds together when the pressure comes. Assembling that staff, testing its coherence, and identifying the individuals who would remain steady under the weight of real command. This was work that happened in offices and map rooms, in exercises and after-action reviews, in the quiet grinding of an institution preparing itself for something it could not fully anticipate. The attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 changed the emotional register of everything. What had previously felt like preparation for a possible future became preparation for an inevitable one. The administrative processes continued, rosters were updated, commands reorganized, orders written, but the mood inside every headquarters in the American military shifted perceptibly. Officers who had spoken of mobilization in the conditional tense began speaking in the definite. The question was no longer whether the United States would commit its military forces to a global war, but only where, when, and in what form. For the First Army, That shift in register was both clarifying and urgent. The work had always mattered. Now it mattered in a way that everyone in the building understood, without needing to be told. In the months that followed, the First Army began to consolidate its authority over the formations assigned to it with a more purposeful hand. Units were evaluated, commanders assessed, and the steady work of identifying which formations were approaching readiness and which needed further investment continued without pause. The Army's senior leadership, including General George Marshall in Washington, was engaged in an enormous parallel effort to determine how American military force would be applied globally, to the Pacific, to North Africa, eventually to northwestern Europe. The First Army was a piece of that larger calculus, and its readiness was not an abstract institutional concern, but a factor in strategic decisions being made at the highest levels. Hodges understood this. The pressure was real, even if it operated at a remove from the daily rhythm of training schedules and personnel reviews. The First Army of 1941 and early 1942 was, by the standards of what it would eventually become, a work in progress. Its headquarters was functional but not yet battle-tested. Its units were trained but not yet experienced. Its commander was respected but not yet proven in the particular crucible that large-scale combat represents. None of this was failure. It was simply the condition of an institution building itself under time pressure, in a nation still adjusting to the reality that its military forces would soon be asked to fight and die in numbers not seen since the Civil War and the Great War combined. The quiet urgency that filled the headquarters buildings and the training fields was the sound of that adjustment happening in real time. What the First Army's early months produced, ultimately, was not yet an army in the full fighting sense of the word. It was the skeleton of one. The command relationships, the staff habits, the organizational identity that would later be filled with combat experience, operational learning, and the kind of institutional confidence that only comes from having been tested against an actual enemy. The men who occupied the First Army's headquarters in those first months would not all remain. Some would rise to greater commands, some would be replaced, some would not survive the years ahead. But the institution they were building together, one administrative decision and training exercise at a time, was the platform from which everything that followed would be launched. Across the Atlantic, the war was already writing the terms of the examination. The First Army was quietly studying for it. The war had not yet touched American soil in any physical sense, but it had already begun reshaping the country from the inside out. Across dusty fairgrounds, converted racetracks, and hastily cleared stretches of southern pine forest, the United States Army was building something it had never truly possessed before, a modern, mass-mobilized fighting force, capable of projecting power across an ocean and sustaining itself thousands of kilometers from home. For the First Army, the years between 1942 and 1944 were not a prelude to the war. They were the war's foundation, laid one grueling field exercise at a time. The men who would eventually wade ashore in France, who would crawl through Norman hedgerows and hold freezing positions in Belgian forests, first had to learn how to be soldiers. That process was neither romantic nor gentle. It was loud, exhausting, frequently humiliating, and absolutely necessary. Without what happened on American soil during those years, nothing that followed could have occurred at all. The scale of the mobilization effort staggers the imagination even now. Training installations expanded at a pace that would have seemed impossible just years earlier, with wooden barracks rising out of fields almost overnight, across states like Louisiana, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Virginia. Hundreds of thousands of men poured into these facilities from every corner of the country. Factory workers and farm hands, college students and coal miners, men who had never traveled beyond their home counties, suddenly finding themselves sharing bunk space with strangers from places they could barely locate on a map. The Army processed them in waves: physical examinations, aptitude tests, inoculations, uniform fittings, and then the slow, methodical business of turning civilians into soldiers. The First Army's area of responsibility spanned the northeastern United States initially, and commanders faced the immediate challenge of coordinating training across a patchwork of installations that had been designed for peacetime garrisons, not for the preparation of mass assault forces. The organizational strain was real and constant, but it forced a certain administrative ingenuity that would later serve the First Army well when it had to manage equally complex logistics under fire. The training doctrine that emerged during these years was shaped by hard experience and hard argument in roughly equal measure. American military planners had studied the wars in Europe and Asia with careful attention, drawing conclusions about the primacy of combined arms, the coordination of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support into a single coherent fighting system rather than separate forces operating in parallel. Getting that coordination right required more than issuing manuals. It required repetition, failure, analysis, and more repetition. Junior officers were put through problems deliberately designed to exceed their current capabilities, forcing them to improvise and adapt rather than simply execute scripted plans. Staff officers practiced the management of supply convoys, casualty evacuation, and communications under simulated stress, because planners understood that the friction of real combat collapses the gap between a competent staff and an incompetent one with brutal efficiency. The men doing the training often did not know exactly what they were being prepared for, but the intensity of the instruction told them that whatever lay ahead would demand everything they had. The Louisiana maneuvers, which had begun even before America's formal entry into the war, cast a long institutional shadow over the First Army's preparation. Those vast exercises across the bayous and pine flats of Louisiana had demonstrated both the promise and the problems of the American military's approach to large-scale ground combat. Commanders had learned that communication systems broke down under the strain of real movement, that logistical assumptions made in headquarters rarely survived contact with actual roads and weather, and that the gap between the map and the terrain could be measured in lives. The First Army absorbed those lessons and built upon them, designing subsequent training exercises that deliberately stressed supply chains, forced commanders to operate on degraded communications, and required infantry to hold positions far longer and under far more adverse conditions than anyone found comfortable. Discomfort, the planners concluded, was the most honest teacher available because Europe would not offer anything gentler. Amphibious training occupied a special and particularly demanding place in the First Army's preparation schedule. The Army understood, even before the specific objectives of the European campaign were finalized, that any assault on the European continent would almost surely require a contested beach landing, the kind of operation that history offered almost no successful precedent for at the scale being contemplated. Training grounds along the Atlantic coast and on the Gulf of Mexico became laboratories for this new form of warfare, where soldiers practiced climbing in and out of landing craft in darkness and cold water, navigating through surf with full equipment, and reorganizing under simulated fire after coming ashore in disorder. The craft themselves were unfamiliar, the sea was frequently uncooperative, and the soldiers were often seasick before they reached the simulated beaches. None of that was considered a problem to be solved. It was considered a condition to be managed, because the real beaches would offer exactly that and considerably worse. The relationship between officers and enlisted men evolved noticeably during this period, shaped by the shared physical misery of extended field exercises. A lieutenant, who could not read a map in darkness, or who consistently found excuses to avoid the worst of a maneuver, lost the respect of his platoon in ways that no amount of rank could easily recover. Conversely, officers who shared the mud, the cold meals, and the grinding exhaustion of a multi-week exercise developed a kind of credibility with their soldiers that formal authority alone could never produce. The First Army's commanders at the higher levels understood this dynamic and deliberately structured training to force officers downward into the discomfort, rather than allowing them to administer from a comfortable remove. Courtney Hodges himself maintained a demanding standard of physical presence in the field, and that expectation filtered down through the chain of command. The culture being built was one in which leadership meant being present where conditions were hardest, not managing events from a distance. Equipment presented its own category of challenge during the training years. Much of what soldiers were initially issued reflected pre-war assumptions about the nature of modern conflict that combat in Europe and the Pacific was already rendering obsolete. Weapons were tested and modified, communications gear was evaluated under field conditions that often exposed its limitations, and vehicles were driven to breakdown and then repaired and driven again. Mechanics and maintenance crews became essential figures in the training environment rather than an afterthought, because the First Army's leadership recognized early that an army whose equipment failed regularly was an army that would stop moving at the worst possible moments. Coordination with American industry ran in both directions. Field observations about equipment performance fed back into production decisions, and new items arriving from factories were immediately thrown into training scenarios to identify problems before soldiers carried them into combat. The process was imperfect and sometimes frustratingly slow, but it produced a force that was far better equipped to sustain itself in the field than anything America had fielded in previous generations. Racial segregation remained a defining and damaging feature of the Army's structure throughout this period, and the First Army was no exception to the broader institutional patterns of the time. African American soldiers trained in separate facilities, commanded initially by white officers in many cases, denied access to advancement and assignment on terms equal to their white counterparts, regardless of individual ability or demonstrated leadership. The contradiction between fighting for democracy abroad and enforcing discrimination at home was not lost on the men subjected to it, and the resentment and frustration that resulted created tensions within training camps that commanders frequently preferred to suppress rather than examine. The human cost of that approach, in talent wasted, morale damaged, and potential leadership squandered, would become evident as the war progressed, though the institutional reckoning with those choices would take far longer to arrive than the war itself. Weather proved to be one of the most consistent and least predictable elements of the training experience. Exercises conducted during the summer months in the American South subjected soldiers to heat and humidity that generated a steady stream of heat casualties, while winter maneuvers in the Northeast and Appalachian foothills produced frostbite, equipment failures in cold temperatures, and the particular misery of sleeping in wet clothing for days at a stretch. Rather than modifying training schedules to avoid the worst of these conditions, First Army planners increasingly sought them out, scheduling the most demanding exercises for periods when weather would add maximum stress. The reasoning was straightforward and cold. The weather over northwestern Europe in the autumn and winter months would be brutal, and soldiers who had never experienced sustained cold weather operations would be at a serious disadvantage when those conditions arrived. Every hour of misery endured on an American training ground was an investment against catastrophe on a European battlefield. By the time the training cycle approached its final intensive phase in late 1943 and into 1944, something had shifted within the First Army that was less quantifiable than any tactical metric, but no less real for that. The men who had entered training as civilians uncertain of their own capabilities had been replaced, not by different people, but by transformed ones. They had learned through repetition and failure and incremental mastery that they could function under stress and exhaustion, that they could navigate in darkness, that they could maintain weapons and vehicles under difficult conditions, that they could coordinate with adjacent units under the noise and confusion of simulated combat. They were not finished soldiers in any sense that combat would later reveal, but they were prepared in ways they could not yet fully appreciate. The training had given them a foundation, not of confidence exactly, but of competence, which is the kind of thing that actually holds when everything else gives way. Final exercises in the months immediately preceding deployment pushed units through scenarios designed to approximate, as closely as possible, the conditions they would face in northern France. Commanders were evaluated not on their performance in ideal conditions, but on their ability to adapt when plans collapsed, which they were deliberately engineered to do. The first army that would eventually embark for the United Kingdom was not the collection of fragmented green units that had assembled 2 years earlier. It was a structured, tested force, with an institutional memory of failure and recovery, hardened by thousands of hours of demanding preparation, and shaped by leaders who had learned their trade, under conditions designed to break men who were not ready. The crossing of the Atlantic lay ahead, the beaches lay beyond that. But between the army that had assembled in 1942 and the one that would now make that crossing, the distance was measured not in kilometers, but in an irreversible transformation that only sustained, serious training can produce. The docks never slept in the spring of 1944. From the port cities of the American East Coast, Boston, New York, Newport News, a procession of men and machines moved without pause, day into night and back again, under skies still bruised by winter. Soldiers descended from troop trains clutching rifles and duffel bags, blinking at the sheer scale of what had been assembled around them. Steel cranes swung overhead, lowering crates of ammunition, crated artillery pieces, medical supplies, and spare parts into holds that seemed to swallow everything offered. The smell of diesel and salt water hung over the piers like a permanent weather system. Sergeants bellowed above the noise, coordinating the loading of tens of thousands of men onto vessels that lined the waterfront as far as the eye could reach. For many of these soldiers, this was their first sight of the ocean. For all of them, it was the moment the war became undeniably real. The movement had been building for months in the careful language of orders and manifests, but now it was physical, visceral, and enormous. Entire divisions shuffled through processing stations, surrendering personal mail, surrendering certainty, receiving life preservers and instructions about what to do if the ship went down. The government had thought carefully about morale, about what men should and should not know before they crossed 3,000 miles of open ocean to fight in a war that had already consumed millions of lives. They were told enough to understand the mission and not quite enough to understand the full weight of it. Officers checked manifests against faces, faces against serial numbers against rosters that seemed to grow longer every hour. The First Army's administrative backbone had grown considerably stronger since the fragmented, improvised days of 1941, and that discipline showed now in the relative order of an embarkation that could so easily have dissolved into chaos. The convoys did not travel as single gatherings of ships moving together in a neat formation. They assembled at sea in loose groupings that stretched across miles of open water, their precise arrangements determined by the logisticians and naval planners who had spent years learning what kept ships and men alive on the North Atlantic. Destroyer escorts moved in wide, restless arcs around the perimeter, their sonar operators listening into the deep with a kind of patient dread. Destroyer escort crews understood the arithmetic of the ocean clearly. A U-boat could detect a convoy before the convoy detected the submarine, and the moment between detection and action was measured in seconds, not minutes. The soldiers aboard the transports understood almost none of this. They understood that they were at sea, that the sea was cold and vast, and that somewhere beneath them things moved with hostile intention. Life below decks settled into its own exhausting monotony within days of departure. Hammocks and bunks were stacked in tiers so close together that a man rolling over in his sleep might disturb 4 others. The air below was warm and close, and smelled of unwashed wool and anxiety. Soldiers played cards for hours until the cards became soft and unrecognizable. They wrote letters they knew would not be posted until they reached England. They argued about baseball and about women and about which European country would have the best food. Some men prayed quietly and without embarrassment. Others slept as much as the rolling of the ship would permit, which was not very much. The North Atlantic in the months before summer does not offer gentle crossings, and a significant number of men who had endured months of vigorous physical training now discovered that the human body's tolerance for physical hardship does not extend reliably to sustained seasickness. The threat beneath the surface was not simply a matter of rumor. German submarine forces had spent years making the North Atlantic one of the most lethal stretches of water in the world, and while the tide of the undersea war had shifted considerably by 1944, Allied anti-submarine technology, air cover from long-range patrol aircraft, and hard-won tactical experience had reduced convoy losses from the catastrophic levels of earlier years. The danger had not disappeared. Escort commanders knew the mathematics of acceptable risk, and those mathematics accepted that some ships might not arrive. The soldiers aboard those ships had no way to make peace with that calculation, except by choosing not to think about it. Most of them succeeded at this for most of the crossing. None of them succeeded entirely. Somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, the last sight of American coastline long vanished behind, and the first sight of Britain still days ahead. The character of the crossing shifted. The immediate anxiety of departure had burned itself out. The routines of shipboard life, however uncomfortable, had become familiar. Men began to think more concretely about what waited for them, not in the abstract terms of training exercises and briefings, but in the specific, personal terms of what they themselves might be required to do and to endure. Officers gathered small groups of men for informal talks that weren't quite motivational speeches and weren't quite tactical briefings. They talked about what the men had trained for, about confidence and preparation, about the soldiers who had fought in North Africa and in Sicily and in Italy, and what those experiences had produced in terms of understanding. The message, delivered in various ways and with varying degrees of eloquence, was consistent. You are ready, and what you are about to do matters. The logistics of feeding and supplying tens of thousands of men at sea for a crossing of this length constituted its own campaign. Kitchens aboard the larger transports ran in continuous shifts, producing meals that were adequate and rarely anything more than that. Fresh food disappeared within the first few days, replaced by the preserved and canned provisions that the Army's Quartermaster Corps had loaded in quantities calculated to sustain men who were burning energy simply by existing in a state of controlled anxiety. Water was rationed. Hot showers were a luxury available on a rotating schedule that many men discovered they could not reliably access. The physical discomforts were real, but they served an unintentional purpose. They reminded men that discomfort was something they had already survived in training, something they had already learned to set aside and work through. Medical officers moved through the ships monitoring the men for more than seasickness. The psychological dimension of the crossing was something that Army medicine had begun to take seriously, shaped by the evidence from earlier theaters of what sustained combat stress could do to men who had not been adequately prepared for it. The men of the First Army had been trained hard and trained long. They had been told, repeatedly and by commanders they respected, that preparation was the best defense against fear. But the crossing was not training, and somewhere between the last American port and the first glimpse of British coastline, every man aboard had to make a private reckoning with the gap between preparation and the real thing. Navigation officers tracked the convoy's progress with the careful attention of men who understood that precision in these waters was not an academic exercise. Course corrections were made regularly, routes adjusted to account for intelligence about submarine positions, about weather patterns, about the tactical calculations of the naval officers coordinating the crossing from shore commands on both sides of the ocean. The convoy did not take the most direct route. Direct routes were predictable, and predictability on the North Atlantic in wartime was a form of vulnerability. The additional days at sea were a reasonable exchange for a reduced chance of encountering a submarine that had been positioned by intelligence to intercept a known shipping lane. When the first indistinct outline of the British Isles appeared on the horizon, it produced a reaction aboard the transport ships that was something more than simple relief. Men pressed to the railings in the gray morning light, straining to make out details in the low, green shape emerging from the mist. They had crossed without catastrophic loss, had endured the ocean and the anxiety and the close quarters and the food, and had arrived at the place where the next chapter of whatever their lives were going to be would begin. There was no cheering, mostly. The sight was too large and too sobering for simple celebration. They had crossed the Atlantic. They had survived the crossing. What they had arrived for was still ahead. The ports of southern and western England received the First Army's soldiers with the practiced efficiency of a country that had been managing the logistics of Allied arrival for years. British dock workers, many of them women, moved crates and equipment with the same calm competence that the American soldiers had observed in their own dockhands back home, and the familiarity of the scene, the cranes, the manifests, the NCOs with clipboards, provided a brief, stabilizing sense of continuity. The soldiers filed off the ships and onto British soil in long, quiet columns, their boots loud on the dock planks. Some of them bent and touched the ground without quite knowing why. The ocean crossing was over. The preparation was almost complete. Southern England stretched out before them, organized and purposeful and filled with the machinery of an invasion that was approaching its final form. And the men of the First Army walked into it, carrying everything they had brought and everything they had become. The ships had barely docked before the orders came. Soldiers who had spent weeks crossing the Atlantic, seasick, cramped, and restless, found themselves funneled off gangplanks and into a country that was simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. England spoke their language, more or less, but it moved at a different frequency. The pubs closed early. The roads were narrow and ran on the wrong side. The skies were the color of old pewter, and they stayed that way for days at a stretch. For the men of the First Army, the United Kingdom was not a destination. It was a threshold, and somewhere beyond it lay everything they had been training for since the war began. The logistics of arrival were staggering in their complexity. Tens of thousands of soldiers, along with vehicles, artillery pieces, crates of ammunition, reels of communications wire, and enough canned rations to fill several warehouses, all had to be sorted, catalogued, and directed to the right place at the right time. British rail networks, already strained by years of wartime demand, were stretched further still. American military police stood at intersections in strange towns they could barely pronounce, directing convoys through medieval street plans that had never anticipated a Sherman tank. Somehow, it worked. Not elegantly, never elegantly, but it worked. And within days, the First Army was beginning to settle into its staging areas across southern England, spreading out into requisitioned country houses, converted airfields, and improvised tent cities tucked behind tree lines and hedgerows. Integration with British forces was not merely a logistical exercise. It was a human one, and like most human endeavors conducted under pressure, it produced both friction and genuine respect. American officers were accustomed to a certain directness in planning sessions. Their British counterparts often preferred a more measured, methodical approach that could read as reluctance to men conditioned to move fast and think in terms of momentum. The reverse was equally true. British officers who had been fighting since 1939 sometimes regarded American confidence with a skepticism they worked hard not to show. Yet beneath the professional courtesy and the occasional sharp exchange behind closed doors, something practical was being built. Liaison officers moved between headquarters. Communications protocols were harmonized. Maps were shared, overlaid, and argued over until the arguments produced something approaching consensus. The machinery of a joint command was assembling itself one relationship at a time. General Courtney Hodges settled into his own rhythms quietly. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures or inspiring speeches delivered from the hood of a jeep. His authority expressed itself through precision, through the careful reading of intelligence reports, the meticulous questioning of subordinates, the long silences that made staff officers choose their words with care before speaking them. He toured the southern English countryside with his corps commanders, sometimes by vehicle, sometimes on foot, across fields that had been green since before America existed as a nation. They studied coastlines, not their own, but the ones they were preparing to assault from the other side of the channel. They looked at maps until the maps became something they could see when they closed their eyes. Every ridge, every road junction, every river crossing that might slow a column or channel a counterattack was noted, discussed, and noted again. The waiting was its own kind of ordeal. Men who had crossed an ocean to fight found themselves spending their days in physical training runs through English villages. in weapons cleaning sessions that produced perfectly clean weapons, in map-reading exercises and first aid drills and lectures on the French countryside, delivered by officers who had themselves never been to France. The repetition was intentional. Commanders knew that when everything went wrong, and they were realistic enough to understand that everything would go wrong, trained reflex would carry men through the moments when conscious thought collapsed under fire. The body had to know what to do, even when the mind went blank. So the runs continued, and the drills continued, and the lectures continued, and the soldiers did what soldiers have always done with the surplus hours that training does not fill. They wrote letters home, they played cards, they argued about baseball, and they waited. Rumors moved through the camps with a velocity that no official communication could match. Every soldier in southern England understood, in the broad sense, what was coming. The invasion of occupied Europe was not a secret the army could keep from the men who would execute it. What remained officially unspoken were the specifics: the date, the location, the precise shape of the plan. In the absence of official information, imagination filled the gap. Some men heard the landings would come in the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. Others were equally certain it would be Normandy, or somewhere further south. A few wild theories circulated about Norway. The officers knew more, but even their knowledge was compartmentalized, with each level of command holding only the portion of the picture it strictly needed. The result was a strange collective anxiety, men preparing intensely for something they could not fully name, steeling themselves against a shape that remained just out of focus. The training itself evolved during these months in Britain. Earlier exercises in the American South had built the foundations: amphibious landings, river crossings, coordinated artillery and infantry movement. Now the work became more specific and more demanding. Soldiers practiced landing on beaches that were meant to simulate what awaited them on the French coast, complete with mock obstacles and timed objectives. Engineers rehearsed the rapid construction of causeways and the clearing of beach obstacles under simulated fire. Communications teams ran exercises where the radios failed, deliberately, forcing junior officers to make decisions without higher guidance, to trust their training and their judgment when the chain of command went temporarily dark. The First Army was being pressed into a particular shape, fitted to a particular task, and the pressing was relentless. Supply officers worked problems that had no elegant solutions. Everything the First Army would need in France had to be staged in Britain first, and then loaded onto ships and landing craft in precisely the right sequence so that the things needed first would arrive first. This sounds simple. It was not simple. It was an exercise in four-dimensional thinking, managing not just what existed, but what would exist, where it would be needed, and when. Fuel, in particular, consumed enormous attention. The vehicles and aircraft supporting the invasion would drink fuel at rates that strained the imagination, and the supply chain linking American ports to English depots to French beaches had to be designed before the beaches themselves had been secured. It was, in effect, planning for a world that did not yet exist, and betting that the planning would be good enough to help bring that world into being. Medical planning ran in parallel, and it was grimly realistic. Casualty estimates for the early waves of a major amphibious assault were never comforting reading, and the planners did not try to make them so. Field hospitals were positioned, blood plasma stocks were accumulated, surgical teams were assigned to units and rehearsed their procedures until the procedures were faster. Evacuation routes back through the Channel were mapped and timed. There was something almost cold about the precision of this preparation, the acknowledgement, in the language of logistics, that a significant number of the men currently running through English fields and cleaning their rifles and writing letters home would be wounded, and that this fact had to be planned for with the same care applied to ammunition resupply. The men who did this planning were not callous. They understood that the planning itself was an act of care, perhaps the most serious act of care available to them. Contact between American soldiers and British civilians produced its own complicated texture. There was genuine warmth in it. British families who had been living under the weight of the war for years found in the arrival of American troops a tangible signal that the balance was shifting. Soldiers were invited into homes, fed meals that their hosts could barely afford to give, shown photographs of sons and brothers already in uniform somewhere else. Children collected American chewing gum and badge insignia with the focused enthusiasm of dedicated archaeologists. But there was friction too, resentments over pay differentials, over the American tendency to move through British spaces with a confidence that occasionally tipped into obliviousness, over the simple human awkwardness of two distinct cultures sharing cramped quarters under enormous pressure. The relationships that formed were genuine, but they were formed in the specific heat of a particular moment, shaped by circumstances that everyone understood would not last. As spring deepened across the English countryside, the tempo of preparation shifted almost imperceptibly but unmistakably. Training exercises became less frequent and more final in character, less like rehearsals and more like dress rehearsals. Equipment was waterproofed, inspected, and waterproofed again. Vehicles received markings. Soldiers received final briefings on objectives they had been told nothing about for months. The staging areas tightened their security perimeters. Movement between camps and civilian areas was restricted. Letters home were collected for delayed posting. The English countryside continued to look precisely as it always had, green and wet and old and quiet. But the men moving through it were changing in some quality that the countryside could not change, hardening towards something that could not be practiced anymore, only done. Hodges looked out from one of those quiet English hills at a channel he would not be among the first to cross. His soldiers would go before him, and before his soldiers would go the paratroopers and the naval gunfire and the aircraft dropping their ordnance into the darkness over Normandy. He had done what a commander could do in the time that had been given. He had studied the ground, he had questioned his officers and trusted the answers. He had watched men train until training became second nature, and he had approved plans he knew were imperfect, because all plans are imperfect, and the imperfection of a plan is not a reason to abandon it, but a reason to train the men executing it to adapt. What came next could not be controlled from a hillside in England. What came next would happen in France, in noise and confusion and the peculiar violent clarity of actual combat, and it would happen very soon. The English Channel had never felt so narrow. Across a strip of gray-green water, roughly 35 kilometers at its tightest point, lay the coast of Normandy and the fate of Western Europe. For months, the men of the United States First Army had trained, waited, and wondered. They had crossed an ocean, settled into the quiet green counties of southern England, and studied maps until the contour lines of a foreign coast felt as familiar as their own hometowns. Now, in the early hours of the 6th of June 1944, the waiting was finished. The greatest seaborne invasion in human history had begun, and the First Army's hour had arrived. General Omar Bradley commanded the American ground forces for Operation Overlord, and it was his name, his face, his voice, that the men of the First Army would follow onto French soil. General Courtney Hodges, the quiet and methodical Texan who had been groomed to take the First Army's reins, stood at Bradley's side throughout the planning phase, absorbing every detail, every contingency, every potential failure mode built into the operation's architecture. The relationship between the two men was not one of rivalry, but of deliberate succession. Bradley trusted Hodges with the institution he himself had built. Hodges carried that trust like a man who understood the weight of it. Together they had spent the weeks before the 6th of June rehearsing not just tactics but the entire system of command, how information would flow, how decisions would be made, how a force of hundreds of thousands would be fed, supplied, and directed in real time across a contested body of water. The assault itself was the work of the First Army's subordinate formations, the men who climbed down rope nets into heaving landing craft before dawn, who crossed the ramp into the surf, who pressed themselves flat against the sand while machine gun fire swept the beach. At Omaha, the landing went wrong almost from the first moment. Currents carried craft off course. Amphibious tanks designed to provide fire support sank in deep water before they ever reached the shore. The men who survived the water found themselves on a narrow strip of sand beneath bluffs that seemed to swallow every attempt to advance. The assault companies at Omaha suffered catastrophic losses in the first hours, and for a time, the outcome on that beach seemed genuinely uncertain. It was not a scene of controlled precision. It was men making terrible decisions under terrible conditions, and some of those decisions, made by sergeants and privates and junior officers, held the beach when higher command could not have saved it. At Utah Beach, to the west, the picture was markedly different. Here the current worked in an unintended way, carrying landing craft roughly 2 kilometers south of their intended objectives, and the place they landed proved more lightly defended than the original target. Casualties were a fraction of what Omaha would suffer. The First Army's men at Utah pushed inland with speed, and the link-up with paratroopers from the airborne divisions, who had landed behind the beaches in the dark hours before dawn, gave the foothold real depth within hours of the first landings. 2 beaches, 2 vastly different stories, and yet both were, by the end of the 6th of June, in Allied hands. Bradley watched the early reports come in from the command ship anchored offshore. The news from Omaha was alarming enough that he considered, however briefly, the possibility of diverting follow-on forces to Utah and abandoning the harder beach entirely. It was a moment that illustrated the brutal arithmetic of high command, the recognition that men already ashore could not always be saved by the decisions of men who were not. He did not abandon Omaha. The men on that beach had already made the decision for him, by fighting their way up those bluffs yard by yard, and by the afternoon of the 6th of June, they had established a precarious but genuine foothold. The question now was how quickly that foothold could be widened and deepened before German reserves arrived in strength. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had made the call to launch the invasion in a weather window that his meteorologists judged barely adequate. A brief improvement after days of violent storms gave him a narrow opening, and he took it, knowing that a delay of 2 weeks would carry its own catastrophic risks. Risks of secrecy broken, of resolve eroded, of a German defensive posture recalibrated. Eisenhower carried that decision alone, as only a supreme commander can. The weather on the 6th of June was rough by any ordinary measure. Seas that tossed landing craft and soaked men to the bone before they ever reached the beach. But it was passable, and the Germans, partially convinced by the conditions that no invasion could come on such a morning, had stood their forces down in critical places. That miscalculation cost them the opening they might have exploited. For the First Army as an institution, the 6th of June was both the moment of maximum drama and, paradoxically, a day of strategic patience. The assault divisions were already committed. The First Army's command function in those early hours was to monitor, adjust, direct the flow of reinforcements, and ensure that what had been gained at such cost was not lost through a failure of follow-through. Hodges and Bradley moved between command posts and communication centers, threading together a picture of the battle from reports that were fragmentary, contradictory, and often hours out of date. The friction of combat does not spare the commanders who remain afloat or in England. It simply presents itself in a different form, as silence where there should be information, as ambiguity where clarity is desperately needed. Within days of the initial landings, the First Army's role shifted from coordination to direct operational control of the expanding bridgehead. Reinforcements poured across the channel, additional infantry divisions, armored formations, engineer battalions, artillery units, and the vast logistical apparatus that a modern army requires to sustain itself. The beaches themselves became extraordinary machinery, with thousands of vehicles and tons of supplies moving across the sand every hour, organized by traffic control officers and supply sergeants working under sporadic artillery fire and the constant threat of Luftwaffe raids. The artificial harbor structures known as mulberry harbors, enormous prefabricated concrete caissons towed across the channel and sunk into position, provided additional offloading capacity, though a severe storm later in June would damage them severely and force even heavier reliance on the beaches themselves. Hodges was absorbed into this vast operation not yet as its principal commander, but as the man who would become its commander, watching, learning, measuring the gap between the doctrines developed in training and the realities that the Normandy terrain was already beginning to impose. The bocage, the dense patchwork of hedgerows, sunken lanes, and small fields that covered the Norman interior, had not appeared quite this formidable on any training ground in North Carolina or Georgia. It was a landscape that seemed designed by nature to favor the defender, offering concealment, channelized approaches, and natural obstacles at every field boundary. The First Army's soldiers were encountering it now for the first time, and the lessons being written in those first days of fighting inland would shape the entire campaign to come. Bradley formally came ashore to establish his forward command post on the Norman coast within days of the initial landing, moving his headquarters from ship to shore as the situation stabilized enough to permit it. The act of setting foot on French soil was not merely symbolic, it was operationally significant. A commander ashore can read terrain, speak directly with division commanders, and respond to the fluid pace of combat with a speed that a commander afloat simply cannot match. With Bradley on the ground, the First Army's grip on its expanding bridgehead tightened, and the complex choreography of feeding new divisions into the line while rotating exhausted units to rest areas began in earnest. The German response to the landings was, in those early days, hampered by command confusion and the success of Allied deception operations, which had convinced a substantial portion of the German high command that the Normandy landings were a feint, and that the main effort was still to come further east. This hesitation in releasing armored reserves to the Normandy front gave the First Army precious time to consolidate, to deepen the bridgehead, to bring additional forces across the channel before the full weight of German armored divisions could be committed. Every day that passed without a decisive German counterattack was a day in which the lodgment became harder to dislodge. The First Army's men, exhausted and still processing the shock of what they had survived on the beaches, were digging in, pushing cautiously inland, and beginning to understand the specific texture of this particular war. By the close of the first week in Normandy, the situation had shifted from survival to development. The beaches were secure. The bridgehead was deepening, if slowly. The First Army had demonstrated, at enormous cost, that the Atlantic Wall could be breached, that determination and firepower and the sheer willingness of ordinary men to advance under fire could force an opening where no opening seemed possible. What lay ahead was another challenge entirely: the grinding, hedgerow by hedgerow struggle through the Norman interior, a campaign that would test the First Army's institutional patience and its tactical ingenuity in ways that the drama of the beaches had not. The 6th of June was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a long, costly education, purchased in blood on a narrow strip of French sand that would not be complete until the flags went up over a defeated Germany nearly 11 months later. The hedgerows of Normandy were not on any map that mattered. They had been growing there for centuries, thick earthen banks, chest-high or higher, crowned with tangled roots and brush so dense that a man could stand 2 meters away from another and never see him. The French called them bocage, and the word carried a pastoral innocence that bore no resemblance to what the First Army found when it pushed south from the beachheads in late June of 1944. These were not decorative features of a picturesque countryside. They were walls, natural fortifications, and the Germans had spent weeks turning them into something even more lethal, cutting firing slits into the earth, nestling machine guns at ankle height so that the first thing an advancing soldier saw was the muzzle flash, not the man behind it. The Norman farmers who had built those banks over generations to divide their fields could not have imagined what they had created for the men of the First Army. Courtney Hodges inherited the weight of those hedgerows from the moment his formations began pushing inland. The battles that followed the initial beach landings had a particular, grinding quality that nothing in training had fully prepared the army for. Moving in open formation across open ground, that was the doctrine, the method practiced across the fields of Georgia and the hills of the American South. But the bocage swallowed formations whole. A company could could advance 50 meters in a single morning, take casualties that would have seemed catastrophic in any other context, and then find itself facing another wall identical to the one it had just crossed, behind which another German squad waited in perfect concealment. Progress was measured not in kilometers but in fields, sometimes in single fields. The psychological toll accumulated as quickly as the physical one. German commanders understood the ground with a precision that came from having chosen it deliberately. When Allied air power dominated open terrain, compelling them to avoid concentrations in the open, the bocage offered a natural antidote. Panzer units that would have been vulnerable on flat ground could be repositioned through narrow lanes shielded from aerial observation. Infantry could hold a hedgerow line with notably few men, forcing the Americans to bring overwhelming numbers to bear against positions that could be abandoned and rebuilt 30 meters further back within minutes. Every field the First Army took cost the next one dearer, because the Germans retreated in good order, learned from each engagement, and adjusted. They were not breaking, they were teaching. American commanders adapted, but adaptation came through pain. The initial instinct to push through with infantry supported by armor produced a particular kind of failure. Tanks attempting to climb hedgerow banks exposed their thin belly armor to German anti-tank weapons positioned exactly to take advantage of that moment of vulnerability. An entire Sherman could be destroyed in the seconds it spent tipping forward over a bank, its crew given no warning and no escape. Sergeants and captains began experimenting on their own initiative, welding scrap metal salvaged from German beach obstacles to the front hulls of tanks to cut through the earth rather than climb over it. The modification spread through the Army rapidly, one of those organic solutions that no staff officer had ordered and no training manual had anticipated. It worked. It was not enough on its own, but it worked. Supply lines stretched back to the beaches, and while the physical distance was not extraordinary, the conditions made every kilometer of road a problem to be solved daily. Vehicles moved in convoy under threat of interdiction, and the roads themselves, narrow, sunken, framed by the same earthen walls that defined the fighting, became bottlenecks. Engineers worked constantly to widen lanes and repair surfaces torn apart by tracked vehicles and artillery. Medical evacuation moved in the opposite direction, a steady current of wounded men flowing backward while ammunition and fuel flowed forward, and both streams competed for the same cramped passages. The army that had crossed the Atlantic to fight a mobile war was fighting a siege, and its logistics reflected the contradiction. Casualties climbed through July in numbers that pressed hard against even the optimistic projections of Allied planners. Infantry units bore the heaviest share. The replacement system, designed to feed individual soldiers into depleted units, produced its own difficulties as fresh men arrived without the particular knowledge that survivors had earned at terrible cost. A replacement who did not know to crouch at the base of a hedgerow rather than press against its face, who had not yet learned to listen for the distinct sound of a German machine gun's rate of fire versus an American one, was a casualty waiting to occur. Veterans tried to share what they knew. The pace of fighting did not always allow it. Units cycled through men at a rate that their commanders found alarming and could not always admit to their superiors. Commanders at every level were learning simultaneously, and the learning had a hierarchical cruelty to it. Generals learned from reports. Colonels learned from battalion commanders. Captains learned from counting their men at the end of each day. Privates learned in the moment, or they did not learn at all. Corps commanders pressed division commanders for advances that division commanders pressed regimental commanders to deliver, and somewhere at the end of that chain of pressure were young men with rifles working out solutions to problems that had never appeared in any field manual. The tension between institutional urgency and tactical reality defined the Bocage campaign at every level of command, and it produced friction, sometimes creative, sometimes destructive, that Hodges and his corps commanders had to manage constantly, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the larger operational picture. Towns along the axis of advance became objectives of their own particular horror. St. Lo sat at the junction of 7 roads, which made it indispensable to any further advance, and therefore indispensable to the Germans to hold. But other towns came before it, collections of Norman stone buildings that German defenders converted into interconnected strongpoints, where rubble created by Allied artillery and airstrikes became additional cover for the men defending the ruins. Clearing a block of houses required a different set of skills than crossing a hedgerow, and the army that had spent the morning fighting one kind of battle found itself fighting another entirely by afternoon. The versatility required of junior leaders was extraordinary, and not all of them possessed it. Those who did became indispensable. Those who did not sometimes took their men with them into disasters that later appeared in casualty reports as dry administrative entries. The question of air support introduced its own agonies. Tactical aircraft were available in greater numbers than any previous generation of soldiers had ever commanded, and when conditions allowed their use, they were devastating to German formations caught in the open. But the bocage limited those conditions severely. Targets were invisible from altitude. The front lines shifted constantly, and the margin for error between striking German positions and striking American ones was narrower than pilots or infantry commanders liked to admit. There were incidents. Some were acknowledged, others were noted in unit diaries and absorbed into the war's accounting without formal recognition. The army learned to coordinate air and ground more precisely through practice, but the learning required failures, and the failures had faces. By the middle of July, the First Army's advance had a different quality than it had possessed 3 weeks earlier. It was slower in some places and more deliberate everywhere, but the deliberateness came from understanding rather than hesitation. Unit commanders had found methods that worked, even partially. Coordination between infantry and armor had improved to the point where the composite team, riflemen and tanks moving in learned patterns, covering each other across the deadly open spaces between hedgerows, had become a functional entity rather than a theoretical one. Engineers had become proficient at tasks they had barely practiced before the campaign. Logistics officers had found workarounds to supply problems that, in the first weeks, had seemed intractable. The army was not the same force that had landed in June. It was harder, more precise, and carrying the weight of everything it had learned and lost. What the First Army had also developed, beneath the tactical adaptations and the institutional learning, was a collective endurance that its soldiers would not have described in those terms. They would have used plainer language, that you kept going because the man beside you kept going, that you crossed the next field because you had crossed the last one, that the hedgerow in front of you was no different from the 50 before it except that this was the one in front of you now. The army that would eventually push through the Norman bocage toward the decisive engagement at Saint-Lô was built from exactly that kind of accumulation, small acts of continuity repeated across weeks and fields and exhausted mornings, until the sum of them became something that bent but did not break. The Germans were formidable. The ground was against the Americans. The weather, frequently overcast and wet, grounded aircraft and slicked the roads and made every day a physical ordeal on top of a tactical one. None of it stopped the First Army. It slowed them, it cost them enormously. But the direction of travel never reversed, and the hedgerows, every last one of them, eventually fell behind. By early July 1944, the First Army faced a strategic crisis that threatened to unravel the entire Normandy campaign. 3 weeks had passed since the landings on the 6th of June, and instead of the rapid breakthrough that planners had envisioned, American forces found themselves locked in brutal attritional fighting within the Norman bocage, a world of dense hedgerows, sunken roads, and small villages that favored the defense. The German army, though shocked by the invasion, had recovered with speed and ferocity, establishing layered defensive lines that proved far more formidable than pre-invasion intelligence had predicted. General Courtney Hodges and his corps commanders faced a hard truth. The American Expeditionary Force could not continue grinding forward kilometer by kilometer, accepting mounting casualties without achieving decisive results. The weather itself had become an enemy, with frequent rain turning fields into mud and limiting air operations that might have broken the stalemate. Eisenhower, watching the campaign from Supreme Headquarters, grew increasingly concerned that the momentum of invasion would dissipate into months of futile trench warfare reminiscent of the First World War. Something dramatic had to be attempted, and that something became Operation Cobra, a plan that would combine the overwhelming force of the entire 8th Air Force with a coordinated ground offensive aimed at shattering German defenses near the town of Saint-Lô. The town of Saint-Lô itself had become symbolic of American frustration with the Normandy campaign. Located roughly 30 kilometers south of the landing beaches, Saint-Lô sat astride the road network that any serious American advance would need to traverse to break out toward Brittany and the interior of France. German forces had transformed the area into a fortress, reinforcing it with artillery, machine gun positions, and counterattack reserves positioned to strike at any American breakthrough attempt. The bocage near Saint-Lô was perhaps the worst terrain imaginable for American tactics. Narrow passages between hedgerows meant that armored vehicles could not maneuver freely, and infantry had to assault prepared positions without the combined arms support that American doctrine depended upon. Repeated assaults throughout June and early July had failed to capture the town, each failure adding to the casualty rolls and the frustration of American commanders. The strategic objective was clear: capture Saint-Lô and break through the German defensive line, opening roads that would allow the First Army to execute the exploitation phase of the invasion plan. But the tactical challenge of actually achieving that breakthrough seemed almost insuperable when every approach was dominated by German positions and every field offered the Germans the advantages of defense. The concept of Operation Cobra represented a radical departure from conventional tactics, and it reflected the desperation that had begun to creep into Allied calculations. The plan called for the 8th Air Force to conduct a massive bombardment using more than 2,000 heavy bombers and countless fighter bombers to pulverize German positions in a narrow zone directly ahead of the American lines. The air assault would be followed immediately by a ground offensive in which the First Army would attack with multiple corps, exploiting the chaos and destruction created by the aerial bombardment to break through German lines before they could recover and reorganize. The sheer scale of the operation was stunning. Commanders hoped that the psychological shock of facing such overwhelming air power would break German morale and resistance in a way that ground combat alone had failed to achieve. Hodges understood that Operation Cobra represented a calculated risk because the bombing would take place in close proximity to American lines, creating the possibility of catastrophic friendly fire incidents. He accepted that risk because the alternative was continuation of the grinding attritional warfare that was bleeding the First Army white without producing decisive strategic gains. The operation was scheduled for the 24th of July, pending weather conditions that would allow the bombers to operate effectively. On the morning of the 24th of July, the weather remained marginal, with heavy cloud cover that threatened to obscure bombing targets. Despite the uncertain conditions, the decision was made to proceed, partly because of the urgency to break the stalemate before autumn rains made operations even more difficult. As the morning progressed, the sky over Normandy filled with bombers approaching from the north in massive formation. Wave after wave of 4-engine bombers carrying loads of high-explosive ordnance toward the Saint-Lô area. From the American positions on the ground, watching soldiers could only stand in awe and horror at the sight of so much air power assembled in one operation, understanding that they would soon advance into whatever remained of the German positions ahead. But from the moment the bombing began, tragedy unfolded in ways that would haunt participants for the rest of their lives. Because of the cloud cover, numerous bombardiers could not see their targets clearly. Communication between air and ground forces proved inadequate to prevent the worst from occurring, and errors in target coordination meant that substantial tonnages of ordnance fell not on German positions but on American troops and positions. The friendly fire casualties mounted throughout the bombing campaign, reaching several hundred soldiers killed or wounded, creating chaos and confusion at precisely the moment when American forces were supposed to launch their ground offensive. The friendly fire disaster created an agonizing dilemma for Hodges and his subordinate commanders. The ground assault was supposed to begin immediately after the bombing ended, while German forces were still in shock and disarray. But the bombing had killed American soldiers and created confusion in American units, raising serious questions about whether those units were capable of launching an effective assault without delay to reorganize and recover. Some senior commanders argued for postponement, fearing that a hasty attack by disorganized units would result in even greater casualties and could fail entirely. Others insisted that the window of opportunity created by the bombing would close if the assault was delayed, and that postponement might allow German forces to recover and restore their defensive capabilities. Hodges made the decision to proceed with the offensive, accepting the risk that American units were not optimally prepared, but gambling that the German positions had been sufficiently damaged and the German command sufficiently shocked that an immediate assault could break through. He ordered the ground forces forward, directing corps and divisions to advance aggressively toward their objectives with the understanding that surprise and momentum might accomplish what perfect coordination and organization could not. The ground assault that followed the bombing represented the kind of determined infantry fighting that had characterized the Bulge campaign since June, but with greater intensity and with the advantage of German positions already disrupted by the aerial bombardment. American infantry units attacked on multiple fronts, moving through the devastated world of bomb craters, uprooted hedgerows, and shattered villages where German resistance was at first sporadic and uncoordinated. The Germans recovered quickly from their shock, however, and desperate counterattacks were launched within hours of the initial assault, attempting to restore their defensive lines before American forces could exploit their breakthrough. Armored divisions, committed in support of the infantry assault, found slightly better maneuvering room as the bombing had opened corridors through the dense bocage, though progress remained slow and costly. By the end of the first day of Operation Cobra, American forces had advanced several kilometers but had not achieved the complete breakthrough that planners had hoped for, despite the massive air support and the German losses inflicted by the bombing campaign. The battle of attrition that followed would continue for several days as American forces slowly expanded their breakthrough, gradually pushing German forces further south and eastward, away from the American lines. The most significant aspect of Operation Cobra was not the spectacular success on the first day, because there was none, but rather the cumulative effect of the operation over the following week. As American forces continued attacking, German High Command faced an impossible choice between committing their limited reserves to restore the line near Saint-Lô or preserving those reserves for potential operations elsewhere. They chose to fight for the Saint-Lô sector, committing units that would be needed elsewhere, a decision that paid dividends for the Allies over the medium term, even if it did not solve the immediate tactical problem. American units learned harsh lessons about fighting in close coordination with air power, lessons that would inform operations for the remainder of the war. Artillery support, improved coordination between divisions and corps, and the sheer weight of American infantry assaults gradually wore down German resistance, unit by unit and village by village. The bocage began to open up as American forces advanced, offering slightly better terrain for maneuver and slightly less advantage to the defending Germans. By early August, barely more than a week after Operation Cobra began, American forces had captured Saint-Lô and pushed beyond it toward the roads that led eastward, roads that would eventually lead to the breakout from Normandy. The human cost of Operation Cobra remained staggering, despite the operational success that eventually emerged. Thousands of American soldiers became casualties during the operation, including the friendly fire victims from the initial bombing. German casualties were equally horrific, with casualties estimates in the several thousands, though precise accounting proved impossible given the chaos of the fighting and the difficulty of recovering German personnel records. The ground commanders who participated in Operation Cobra carried deep scars from the experience, particularly those who witnessed or learned of soldiers killed by friendly fire from American bombs. General Omar Bradley, who coordinated the ground assault as commander of the 12th Army Group under which the 1st Army operated, later spoke of the moral anguish of ordering forward troops that had just been bombed by their own air force. These experiences would inform doctrinal changes after the war in how air and ground forces coordinated their operations, yet such lessons could only be learned through tragedy and hard experience. The soldiers of the First Army who survived Operation Cobra emerged from the experience hardened and realistic about the costs of breaking through prepared defensive lines, understanding that technological superiority did not guarantee easy victory. Beyond the immediate tactical results, Operation Cobra represented a turning point in the Normandy campaign that was not always apparent to participants in the moment. The breakout from the Norman bocage that Operation Cobra began would continue throughout August, accelerating into the rapid advance that characterized the rest of summer 1944. The roads that lay beyond Saint-Lô, roads that American planners had identified months before the invasion, now lay open to the First Army, and the campaign transformed from a grinding attritional struggle into mobile warfare that favored American maneuver and firepower. The Germans, realizing that the Normandy position had become untenable, began withdrawing forces toward the Seine River, but American and British forces would pursue them relentlessly, eventually trapping them in the Falaise pocket and destroying the Wehrmacht's capacity for organized defense in France. None of this could have happened without the breakthrough that Operation Cobra, despite its tragic beginning, had made possible. The operation also marked a kind of maturation of American military operations in the European theater. The nightmare of friendly fire would haunt commanders and troops, but the operation demonstrated that American industry and resources could overcome strategic challenges through raw force applied with courage and determination. The period immediately following Operation Cobra saw the First Army accelerated across newly captured terrain, with divisions pushing eastward and southeastward toward objectives that seemed increasingly reachable. The pace of advance that would have seemed impossible a week earlier now appeared almost normal as German resistance collapsed behind the tactical breakthroughs achieved by American forces. Supply lines strained under the demands of supporting an army advancing dozens of kilometers per day, a problem that would soon become critical. But for now, commanders focused on exploiting the tactical advantage that Operation Cobra had provided. Hodges directed his corps to maintain pressure on retreating German forces, to seize crossing points over rivers before German engineers could destroy them, and to maintain the momentum that might carry the First Army all the way across France before German forces could establish new defensive positions. The vision of the rapid exploitation campaign that had existed in planners' minds before the invasion suddenly seemed achievable, no longer a distant dream but an operational objective within reach. If only the First Army could sustain its attack and maintain cohesion while advancing at unprecedented speeds. In retrospect, Operation Cobra stands as one of the most dramatic and consequential operations of the Normandy campaign, a turning point that separated the first phase of the invasion from the second, more successful phase. The operation combined massive applications of American air power with determined ground combat, creating a breakthrough that psychological shock alone would not have achieved. The friendly fire incidents that marred the beginning of Operation Cobra represented the costs of conducting modern warfare with complex coordination across different branches of the military and different commands, costs that modern military organizations continue to grapple with to this day. Yet from those tragic moments emerged lessons learned and capabilities developed that would shape the remainder of the European campaign and inform military doctrine for generations to come. The soldiers of the First Army who attacked beyond Saint-Lô in early August 1944 carried forward the knowledge that breakthrough was possible, that the grinding stalemate of the bocage was over, and that the liberation of France lay ahead. They had paid a terrible price for that knowledge, but they had also achieved the objective that Supreme Commander Eisenhower and the combined American and British leadership had set for them in the spring of 1944. The German High Command had been waiting for a moment of weakness. Through the summer of 1944, as American forces ground forward through the bocage with agonizing slowness, German generals studied the maps and searched for an opportunity. They saw it in early August when American forces spread thin across a widening front, stretching supply lines toward the breaking point. General Courtney Hodges's First Army had proven tough and methodical, but to the German commanders, toughness could be exploited if the moment was seized with sufficient force. Adolf Hitler himself demanded action, demanding a counterattack that would drive westward toward the coast and sever American supply lines entirely. The result was Operation Lüttich, a desperate gamble that would instead create the greatest catastrophe yet for the Wehrmacht in France. On the 6th of August, 1944, German armored divisions launched their counteroffensive from the town of Mortain, striking westward toward the small seaside port of Avranches. The attack fell on elements of the American 7th Corps, commanded by General J. Lawton Collins, a capable and aggressive officer who would prove essential in the days ahead. German panzers rolled forward with considerable force, and for a brief moment it appeared they might achieve their objective. But Collins and his subordinates did not panic. Rather than retreat, Collins pivoted his forces, slowing the German advance while simultaneously calling on Hodges and higher command for reinforcement. The Germans had expected to pour through a gap in the American lines. Instead, they would find themselves moving deeper into a box that was quietly closing around them. Hodges grasped the strategic reality almost immediately. His intelligence officers and combat observers reported the German offensive's direction and force composition, and what he saw was not a threat, but an opportunity. The Germans were committing their mobile reserves, their panzer divisions and mechanized units, in a concentrated thrust westward toward Avranches. This meant they were moving away from the rest of their army, moving away from their supply bases, moving away from reinforcement. If the First Army and British forces to the north could respond quickly enough, the Germans would not punch through to the coast, but instead would find themselves trapped in a cauldron, surrounded on nearly all sides. Hodges immediately coordinated with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and the Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower to transform the crisis into an encirclement. The plan was audacious but clear. Allow the Germans to drive westward while American and British forces closed in from north, south, and east, creating a pocket from which escape would become increasingly impossible. The town of Falaise, located to the north in Normandy, became the focal point of the operation. British and Canadian forces under Montgomery's command would drive southward from their lines near Caen, attempting to seal off the northern jaw of the trap. Meanwhile, Hodges coordinated the southern jaw, directing his corps commanders to swing northward and eastward to block German escape routes. General George Patton's Third Army, which had recently been activated and placed under Hodges's command, would race northward with its armored divisions, driving deep into the German rear. These were not cautious, methodical operations, but rapid, aggressive maneuvers, executed by commanders who understood that the Germans had gifted them a historic opportunity. Speed became essential. Delay would allow German commanders to recognize the trap and begin withdrawals before it snapped shut. The coordination between American and British forces, never seamless, would now be tested under the pressure of a fast-moving situation where minutes could mean the difference between triumph and the enemy's escape. For 4 days and nights, the First Army and its attached units drove northward with remarkable determination. American soldiers who had endured weeks of grinding combat through the bocage suddenly found themselves pursuing a broken enemy rather than fighting through dense defensive positions. Armored columns raced along roads, covering distances that would have been unthinkable just days earlier, while supporting infantry followed to secure captured ground and prevent German counterattacks. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin, and fuel shortages became a critical concern, but commanders accepted the risk in exchange for the possibility of destroying German forces wholesale rather than capturing them piece by piece over months of continued fighting. The Germans, caught between the jaws of the closing trap, found their options evaporating by the hour. Some commanders tried to organize coherent withdrawals toward the eastern gap that remained open. Others attempted to break out westward toward Brittany, where they hoped to establish new defensive lines. Still others simply abandoned their units and attempted to save themselves through the chaos. By the 12th of August, 1944, the trap was beginning to close in earnest. American forces moving northward from the south and west collided with German forces attempting to push back through the narrowing corridor. The battles in this phase were sharp and violent, units crashing into one another in terrain increasingly congested with burning vehicles, dead soldiers, and desperate men struggling to escape. German panzer divisions, which had begun the month in a posture of aggressive offense, now found themselves fighting rearguard actions, trying to keep escape routes open while protecting the main body of retreating forces. The Falaise pocket was not yet fully sealed, but the walls were closing rapidly. Hodges and his corps commanders pushed their divisions harder, accepting casualties and logistical strain in pursuit of the strategic objective. American tank crews found themselves in close combat with German armor, the speed of events creating moments of confusion where friend and foe were separated by only hundreds of meters, and the fortunes of battle could shift with remarkable swiftness. The critical moment came on the 15th and 16th of August. American and Canadian forces linked up near the small town of Chambois, closing the northern and southern portions of the pocket. German forces, numbering somewhere in excess of 50,000 soldiers, found themselves trapped in an area roughly 40 kilometers across, with their escape routes collapsing. The Germans still attempted to force their way out, and the fighting became savage and desperate. German soldiers fought with the ferocity of men who understood that surrender or breakthrough were their only options, and many chose to fight to the death rather than accept captivity. American and Canadian artillery, positioned on high ground overlooking the pocket, pounded German positions relentlessly. Air support, when weather permitted, added to the devastation. German logistical units, cut off from supply sources, were overrun and destroyed. Tank battles raged across open ground as German commanders made one final effort to smash through the American lines and escape toward Germany. The Germans who broke through the American and Canadian lines in the final days of the pocket did so at tremendous cost. Entire divisions were shattered, their organizational structures destroyed, their vehicles abandoned or burned. The Falaise pocket became a graveyard for German military equipment and hopes. Thousands of German soldiers were killed in the intense fighting of the encirclement, their bodies left across fields and roads that would bear the scars of battle for years afterward. Thousands more were taken prisoner, men who had survived the fighting and surrendered rather than die in a hopeless situation. The Wehrmacht's capacity to wage coherent, organized warfare in France had been devastated in a matter of days. What had begun as a German attempt to turn the tide had instead become the military catastrophe that guaranteed Germany's defeat in the West. For the First Army and its soldiers, the Falaise pocket represented vindication of a different kind of warfare. No longer grinding through fortified positions, American forces had demonstrated they could move with speed and coordination, that they could recognize and exploit enemy mistakes, that they could execute complex operations involving multiple divisions and different commands in pursuit of a strategic objective. Hodges had proven himself a capable commander of large-scale operations, capable of recognizing opportunity and acting decisively to exploit it. His corps commanders had responded with aggression and tactical skill, pushing their men beyond what might have seemed reasonable limits in pursuit of the encirclement. The soldiers themselves, many of whom were combat veterans by this point in the campaign, had shown they could operate in fluid, fast-moving situations as well as they could endure the grinding combat of the bocage. The psychological impact was profound, shifting the entire character of the campaign from a methodical advance to an accelerating pursuit. The consequences of Falaise extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The destruction of German forces meant that resistance would be thinner and more fragmented in the coming weeks. The Wehrmacht would no longer be able to launch coordinated counteroffensives or defend in strength across broad fronts. German forces would be reduced to attempting to delay American and British advances, buying time for whatever defensive preparations could be made further east. The rapid American advance from Normandy toward the Seine and beyond became possible because German armies in France had been shattered at Falaise. The loss of so much equipment, so many vehicles, so many trained soldiers would haunt German operations for the remainder of the European campaign. German industry, already strained by the demands of multiple fronts, could not replace the losses, could not manufacture enough tanks and trucks and weapons to reconstitute the armies that had been destroyed or trapped. The Falaise Pocket was not the final battle of the European war, but it was perhaps the moment when German defeat in France became absolutely certain, when the Wehrmacht transitioned from conducting defensive operations to conducting a withdrawal that would not end until German armies stood before the Rhine. The human cost of the Falaise Pocket was substantial for the First Army as well. American soldiers were killed and wounded in the fighting that closed the trap, and German prisoners had to be managed and processed by American units already stretched thin by the rapid advance. The medical services of the First Army dealt with a surge of casualties that strained their resources and their personnel, but from the perspective of military commanders and strategic planners, the cost was acceptable, more than justified by the scale of the German defeat. The First Army had inflicted a catastrophe on German forces without fighting a set-piece battle, without the kind of grinding attrition that had characterized so much of the Normandy campaign. Instead, through speed, coordination, and the willingness of commanders to exploit enemy mistakes, the First Army had achieved in days what might have taken weeks of conventional combat operations. Hodges and his officers understood that they had crossed a threshold in the campaign, that the period of methodical breakthrough was ending, and the period of rapid pursuit was beginning. The First Army would never again face a German enemy capable of launching large-scale offensives or defending in coordinated strength across France. From this point forward, the question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but how quickly that defeat could be achieved. The Falaise Pocket also marked a turning point in the relationship between American and British commanders in the European theater. The success of the operation, achieved through the coordination of Montgomery's British and Canadian forces, with Hodges's American First Army and Patton's Third Army, demonstrated that, despite the personality conflicts and strategic disagreements that characterized the higher command, operational coordination remained possible when the stakes were clear and the objective was well defined. Yet the success also exposed the limitations of that coordination, the difficulty of achieving perfect synchronization between different national armies operating under different chain of command structures. Some German forces escaped the pocket when they might have been prevented from doing so, had American and British/Canadian forces moved with slightly greater speed or slightly tighter coordination. These were the kinds of tactical details that would be analyzed and debated for decades after the war, but they did not change the fundamental reality that the German armies in France had been shattered at Falaise. The Wehrmacht in the West, once a formidable and dangerous adversary, was now a broken force attempting to conduct a fighting withdrawal toward Germany, and the defensive lines that commanders hoped would slow the American advance long enough for some kind of negotiated peace, a hope that would prove as futile as the offensive from Mortain. By the middle of August 1944, as the Falaise Pocket was being mopped up and German forces were streaming eastward in disorganized retreat, the First Army stood at a threshold. The long struggle through Normandy, the grinding breakthrough at Saint-Lô, and the destruction of German armies at Falaise had fundamentally altered the character of the European campaign. German forces could no longer conduct large-scale offensive operations, could no longer mount coherent defensive lines against American attacks. The First Army had demonstrated that it could move with speed and purpose, that it could execute complex operations involving multiple corps and divisions, that it could recognize and exploit the mistakes of an adversary. The soldiers of the First Army, many of whom had landed in Normandy less than 10 weeks earlier, had endured weeks of brutal combat and had emerged as combat veterans of considerable skill and determination. Courtney Hodges had established himself as a capable army commander, capable of maintaining control of large-scale operations and making the kinds of strategic decisions that could turn tactical opportunities into operational victories. The road ahead would still be long, still be costly, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany would be defeated in the West, and the First Army would be the instrument of that defeat. By late August 1944, the First Army had shattered German resistance in the Norman bocage and burst through the collapsing defenses at Saint-Lô. The Wehrmacht in France was no longer a cohesive force capable of sustained defense, but rather fragments of units fleeing eastward in disarray. General Courtney Hodges sensed the opportunity with the clarity of a commander who understands that wars are won not merely by defeating enemies in battle, but by pursuing them relentlessly before they can reorganize. The First Army, swollen to more than 500,000 men with tanks, trucks, and artillery stretching back across the Norman landscape, faced a choice that would define the next phase of its campaign. It could consolidate its gains, rest its weary soldiers, and methodically advance eastward. Or it could exploit the collapse with everything available, driving deep into enemy territory before German commanders could establish new defensive lines. Hodges chose exploitation, and in that choice lay both the glory and the agony of the weeks to come. The pursuit across northern France began with a sense of liberation, in every sense of the word. French civilians who had endured 4 years of German occupation emerged from their towns and villages as American columns rolled past, their gratitude expressed in flowers thrown at passing soldiers, in wine offered from cellars that had been hidden from German requisition, in embraces and tears of relief. The soldiers of the First Army, most of them still teenagers or in their early 20s, experienced something that no amount of training could prepare them for: the intoxicating rush of being welcomed as saviors. Villages that had been fortified German positions 1 week earlier became scenes of spontaneous celebration the next. Yet beneath the joy lay a persistent tension that commanders could never ignore. German rearguards, though thin and increasingly desperate, remained capable of inflicting casualties when American units became careless or overextended. Combat patrols clashed with retreating German infantry in small towns whose names meant nothing to anyone in uniform, but where bullets were no less lethal than they had been in Normandy. The First Army was advancing, yes, but it was advancing into danger, and Hodges knew that momentum without caution could transform triumph into catastrophe. The logistics of pursuit proved nearly as demanding as the combat itself. An army moving at the speed the First Army now traveled consumed enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement parts for vehicles and weapons. The supply lines stretched backward across Normandy, through the Norman ports that had been devastated in the invasion and were only slowly becoming functional, and across the English Channel to bases in Britain. Every kilometer eastward meant supplies had to travel that much farther to reach forward units, and the roads themselves became bottlenecks of astonishing complexity. Trucks moving forward had to navigate around tanks, artillery pieces, and infantry columns while evacuating casualties and German prisoners of war in the opposite direction. The roads of France, many of them secondary routes that would have been considered marginal even in peacetime, buckled under the weight of American military traffic. Hodges and his supply officers confronted a mathematical reality. The faster the army advanced, the less fuel and ammunition could reach the leading combat units. It was a paradox that no amount of logistical brilliance could entirely resolve. The solution, temporary and exhausting, was to accept periodic slowdowns while supply lines caught up, a rhythm of advance and pause that frustrated aggressive commanders but preserved the army's ability to fight. On the 19th of August 1944, advanced elements of the First Army reached the approaches to Paris itself. The city, capital of France and one of Europe's greatest centers of culture and history, had been under German control for more than 4 years. Its liberation would represent far more than a military objective achieved. It would signal to the world that the Allied cause was not merely winning battles, but restoring nations to freedom. Yet the First Army did not liberate Paris alone. French resistance fighters who had been preparing for this moment since the early dark years of German occupation rose against their occupiers even as American forces approached. The German garrison commander, General Dietrich von Choltitz, faced orders from Hitler to destroy the city rather than allow it to fall intact into American hands. Instead, von Choltitz chose the path of pragmatism and humanity, negotiating the city's surrender rather than fighting a hopeless battle in its streets. The liberation of Paris became a shared moment, neither wholly American nor wholly French, but a convergence of liberation movements that had been building for years. First Army units entered the city on the 25th of August, greeted by crowds of ecstatic Parisians who poured into the streets to celebrate their freedom. The scene was one of genuine national catharsis, yet even as celebrations erupted, American officers maintained discipline and security, aware that German forces remained nearby, and that the war, despite its seeming inevitability of Allied victory, was far from over. The capture of Paris created an immediate complication for Hodges and his superiors. Normandy was the First Army's original objective, but now the army found itself deep in France, with German forces still dangerous and increasingly desperate to the east. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower and the High Command faced questions about whether to divert resources to the occupation and securing of Paris, or whether to maintain momentum against the retreating Germans. The decision, ultimately, favored continuation of the offensive. Paris would be secured, but the First Army would not pause indefinitely to garrison the city. Other forces would be detailed to handle occupation duties and the restoration of civil administration. Hodges was instructed to keep pushing eastward, to maintain pressure on German forces before they could establish new defensive lines. The Seine River, flowing through Paris and continuing northwestward toward the English Channel, lay immediately before the First Army's forward units. Crossing this major waterway would require engineering troops, assault boats, and careful coordination between infantry and supporting arms. The river, though not as formidable as the Rhine would prove to be later in the campaign, remained a significant obstacle that German engineers had prepared with typical Teutonic thoroughness. The crossings of the Seine took place over several days in late August and early September 1944, with different First Army units forcing the river at multiple points to maintain momentum and prevent German defenders from establishing coherent resistance. The first crossings were effected with relative success, as German forces lacked the reserves and coordination to mount effective counterattacks. Engineers worked under artillery fire to establish bridges and ferry points, while assault boats filled with infantry crossed the current under enemy fire. The Seine's water was cold, and the banks were often muddy and treacherous, requiring soldiers to struggle not merely against enemy fire, but against the terrain itself. Machine gun fire from German defenders positioned on the far bank claimed casualties among American troops, and some assault boats were struck before reaching the opposite shore. Yet the momentum of the American advance, combined with the overwhelming superiority in numbers and supporting artillery, enabled successive waves of American infantry to establish and expand bridgeheads on the eastern bank. By early September, the First Army had secured multiple crossing points and was pushing eastward with German resistance increasingly fragmented and disorganized. The Seine River, which had been the natural fortress that had protected France from invasion for more than 1,000 years, became merely another obstacle surmounted in the relentless forward motion of mechanized warfare. As the First Army advanced beyond the Seine, it entered a landscape transformed by the scale of the military machine in motion. Thousands of trucks moved eastward carrying supplies and reinforcements, while damaged German vehicles and equipment littered the roads behind the advancing American columns. French towns that had seen relatively little combat during the liberation of Normandy now experienced the chaos of rapid military advance. American engineers worked to repair roads and clear obstacles, while German prisoners of war, numbering now in the tens of thousands, were herded into compounds for processing and eventual transport to prisoner of war camps. The sight of defeated German soldiers, many of them young conscripts who had been swept into Hitler's army through no choice of their own, offered stark contrast to the enthusiastic liberation celebrations that had occurred in Paris. Some German prisoners were treated with the courtesy due to military opponents. Others experienced the anger of American soldiers who had seen friends killed in recent combat. The complexity of warfare in a liberated country became apparent in these human encounters. questions about occupation, justice, and the treatment of defeated enemies that would continue to perplex commanders long after the fighting ended. The rapid advance also revealed the scope of German logistics and the resources that had sustained the occupation of France for 4 years. American soldiers discovered enormous supply depots, many of them partially intact, containing food, fuel, ammunition, and equipment that German forces had accumulated and were abandoning as they retreated. These discoveries provided windfall supplies for the First Army's continuing advance, alleviating some of the pressure on American supply lines that stretched ever farther backward. Yet the very abundant play of captured supplies also created new problems. Sorting through depots, identifying what was usable and what was obsolete, and determining whether certain supplies were booby-trapped consumed time and resources. German defenders, though weakened, remained creative in their rear-guard actions. They demolished bridges across smaller streams and rivers, planted mines in roads and buildings, and occasionally mounted counterattacks designed not to stop the American advance, but to disrupt it sufficiently to buy time for German commanders to establish new defensive positions farther east. Hodges and his corps commanders had to continually balance the temptation to advance as rapidly as possible against the necessity of maintaining unit cohesion, securing supply lines, and ensuring that rapid movement did not become reckless exposure. By early September 1944, the First Army had advanced more than 300 kilometers from the landing beaches of Normandy. It had liberated significant portions of France, crossed major rivers, and shattered German military formations that had controlled France for years. Yet, as the army paused to consolidate its position and address logistical challenges, the initial momentum of the pursuit began to slow. The Germans were establishing new defensive positions along a line running roughly from Belgium in the north, through Luxembourg and along the German border in the south. These new positions, though not as elaborate as the Norman bocage, or the fixed fortifications of the Siegfried Line farther east, were becoming progressively stronger as German commanders rallied depleted units and received reinforcements from other theaters. The euphoria of liberation gave way to the recognition that the war would not end quickly, that German soldiers would fight again, and that the First Army would have to adapt to a new phase of the campaign in which rapid exploitation would no longer be possible. Supply shortages began to bite harder as the extended lines of communication could not sustain the full strength of the army in offensive operations. Fuel rationing, already necessary, became more severe, forcing Hodges to make choices about which units could continue attacking and which had to halt and wait for supplies to catch up. The human toll of the pursuit, though lower than it had been in the intense fighting around Saint-Lô, remained significant and cumulative. American soldiers were exhausted from weeks of continuous combat and movement, sleeping in the open or in barns when they slept at all, eating inadequate rations, and struggling with diseases caused by poor hygiene and constant exposure to weather. Trench foot, dysentery, and respiratory infections ravaged units as thoroughly as German bullets and shells. Replacement soldiers arrived to fill the gaps created by casualties, but these replacements often lacked the cohesion and experience of the original combat soldiers, and their integration into worn-out units created friction and inefficiency. The psychological weight of extended combat, though not yet at the breaking point that some units would experience later in the campaign, was becoming evident in increased rates of what was then termed shell shock or battle fatigue. Hodges and his division commanders were acutely aware that an army driven too hard without adequate rest and replenishment would eventually become incapable of effective action, and they began advocating for operational pauses that would allow time for reorganization and recovery. The liberation of Paris and the crossing of the Seine represented a watershed in the First Army's campaign, but one that was more complex and less conclusive than the triumphant narrative of those early September days would suggest. The First Army had achieved remarkable things. It had destroyed German military formations, liberated France's greatest city, and positioned itself for further advances eastward. Yet it had also revealed the deep tensions inherent in modern military operations. the contradiction between rapid exploitation and logistical sustainability, between the desire to end the war through speed and the reality that armies cannot advance faster than their supplies can be delivered. The German enemy, though battered, was not yet defeated, and the nature of the campaign was now shifting from one of rapid pursuit to one of methodical advance against strengthening resistance. The soldiers of the First Army, who had tasted victory and experienced the gratitude of liberated peoples, could not yet know that more than 8 months of hard fighting lay ahead before Germany would surrender unconditionally. The months from September through May 1945 would test the First Army in ways that even the bitter fighting in Normandy had not, and the speed of advance through France would soon seem like a distant memory of easier times. By early September 1944, the First Army had accomplished something that few military planners believed possible. In merely 3 months since establishing their first beachheads in Normandy, American forces under General Courtney Hodges had liberated Paris, crossed the Seine River, and advanced nearly 400 kilometers into France. Divisions that had spent months in the bocage, fighting for every village and hedgerow, suddenly found themselves racing across open terrain, at speeds reminiscent of the great cavalry offensives of centuries past. German resistance, once organized and fierce, had fractured into desperate rearguard actions. The momentum seemed unstoppable, and victory appeared not as a distant objective, but as something almost within grasp. Yet this astonishing success carried within it the seeds of a crisis that would test the First Army far more severely than any German counterattack. The problem was deceptively simple to understand, but catastrophically complex to solve. Every tank that moved forward, every soldier that advanced, every shell that was fired, consumed supplies that had to travel backward across the entire conquered territory to reach them. The First Army's supply lines had grown so elongated and so strained that they had become the most critical constraint on further operations. Ammunition trucks that once could reach forward units in a matter of hours now required full days of driving across damaged roads. Gasoline, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, had become so scarce that tankers had to make difficult choices about which divisions received fuel and which were forced to pause. Food convoys were interrupted by destroyed bridges and German demolition teams who stayed behind to sabotage routes. The logistical nightmare that planners had worried about in quiet strategy sessions was unfolding in real time, and commanders found themselves in the painful position of having to deliberately slow their advance to keep their army from collapsing under its own weight. General Hodges faced a situation that would have broken commanders with less iron in their character. His subordinates were calling for supplies that simply did not exist in sufficient quantities. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group to which the First Army belonged, was simultaneously supporting the Third Army under General George Patton, whose aggressive thrust eastward was also consuming enormous quantities of fuel and ammunition. The competition between these two armies for scarce resources became bitter. Patton, known for his outspoken demands and his willingness to bypass channels to get what he wanted, frequently complained that the First Army was hoarding supplies while his army languished. Meanwhile, the supply chain that brought materials across the Channel remained constrained by the limited capacity of captured French ports and the continued reliance on Cherbourg, which had been severely damaged during its capture. The Americans possessed overwhelming industrial capacity at home, but the ocean itself had become the bottleneck, and no amount of production in American factories could change that reality in the short term. The crisis forced an uncomfortable reckoning with the limits of logistics and strategy. Commanders who had been emboldened by months of breakthrough success suddenly faced the humbling reality that military campaigns are governed by equations of supply and demand as rigidly as any commercial enterprise. A division that had been advancing 30 kilometers per day in late August found itself nearly stationary by mid-September, not because it faced insurmountable enemy resistance, but because its fuel trucks could not catch up with its lead elements. Tank crews sat immobilized because ammunition was being rationed. Infantrymen who had tasted victory and expected to carry that momentum into Germany found themselves digging in defensively along limited lines, watching the autumn weather deteriorate and knowing that their enemy had time to regroup. The pause was agonizing for field commanders who sensed that a few more weeks of aggressive exploitation might have brought complete victory before German forces could establish new defensive lines. Yet the mathematics of logistics admitted no argument. A supply line stretched across 400 kilometers could only sustain so much combat power, and the First Army was already at that threshold. The human cost of these shortages became visible in ways that statistics could not capture. Soldiers shivered through increasingly cold September nights in uniforms designed for summer campaigning because winter clothing had been deemed unnecessary when planners had optimistically predicted that the war in Europe would be finished by September. Wounded men waited longer for medical evacuation because ambulances faced the same fuel restrictions as combat vehicles. Forward artillery batteries sometimes held their fire, not because targets were unavailable, but because ammunition could not be delivered in sufficient volume. Infantry units, hungry and exhausted, watched supplies being diverted to maintain the mechanized divisions that had spearheaded the breakthrough. Resentment festered quietly among men who had fought since June and found themselves in a war of patience when they had expected a war of movement. Morale remained generally steady because soldiers understood that they were not the victims of incompetence, but rather of overwhelming circumstance. Yet the frustration was palpable. This was a different kind of attrition from German bullets and artillery, but it was attrition nonetheless, grinding away at the army's capacity to maintain its fighting power. Supply officers and logistics planners worked nearly around the clock to improvise solutions that might provide even marginally more capacity. Engineers repaired roads and bridges that German demolition teams had destroyed, working with methodical determination to restore supply routes. Trucks were requisitioned from rear areas and diverted forward to create additional haul capacity, even though this meant reducing support services elsewhere. Field commanders were ordered to restrict ammunition consumption and to rely more on tactical bombing to provide fire support that conserved shells. Hospitals were established in forward areas to return wounded soldiers to combat more quickly rather than evacuating them across the entire logistical system. Captured German supply dumps were thoroughly searched for fuel, ammunition, and food that could supplement American stocks. Even French civilians were enlisted to help move supplies by hand in areas where vehicle transport was impossible. None of these measures solved the fundamental problem, but collectively, they provided enough additional capacity to prevent total collapse. The system operated perpetually on the edge of catastrophe, maintained by constant improvisation and the suppression of the higher demands that forward units constantly made. General Hodges proved himself a capable administrator under pressure, though this side of his service rarely received the attention that his combat operations did. He worked closely with his supply chief and other officers to make ruthless decisions about resource allocation. He had to tell division commanders that their requests for additional ammunition could not be granted. He had to order aggressive operations to be postponed, despite pressure from higher headquarters to maintain momentum. He had to balance the demand to support the advance with the obligation to maintain sufficient reserves to respond to unexpected German threats. These decisions, invisible to the soldiers in the front lines and rarely mentioned in historical accounts, were as crucial to the First Army's survival as any tactical maneuver. Hodges had inherited a command that was supposed to be the cutting edge of American military power, and he was now forced to operate it well below the level of combat intensity that its doctrine demanded. Yet he did so with the understanding that this crisis was temporary, that supplies would eventually flow more freely once additional ports were captured and developed, and that the worst of the shortage would pass with time. The psychological dimension of the supply crisis manifested in ways that commanders found troubling. Rumors circulated through the ranks that supplies were being deliberately withheld, that favoritism was determining which units received resources, that the war was being prolonged for political reasons. Officers at higher headquarters were accused of incompetence, even though in reality they were performing heroic work under impossible circumstances. The natural suspicion that soldiers harbored toward those in command was amplified by the frustration of visible victory being held just beyond reach. Men compared their empty ammunition belts to what they imagined Patton's army must be carrying, not understanding that both armies faced essentially identical constraints. The supply crisis, because it was invisible and because its effects were experienced differently across different divisions, became a focal point for discontent that might otherwise have been directed solely at the enemy. This psychological toll, though difficult to quantify, was real and persistent, and it gnawed at morale as surely as any physical hardship. By late September, the strategic implications of the supply shortage had become impossible to ignore. The German army, far from being routed into complete collapse, had regrouped along a series of defensive positions that became known as the Siegfried Line, a formidable fortification system that protected the German homeland. Hodges and Bradley began to acknowledge, in their planning sessions and in reports sent to Supreme Headquarters, that the war would not end in 1944. The window of opportunity that had briefly seemed open in August had closed. The First Army would have to settle in for a longer campaign, one that would stretch through the autumn and into the winter months. Resources that had been stretched to achieve rapid advance now had to be managed for a sustainable campaign of attrition and grinding positional warfare. The transition from exploitation to stalemate was bitter for commanders who had believed themselves on the threshold of complete victory just weeks earlier. Yet it was necessary, and Hodges moved to implement it with the same methodical professionalism that had guided his earlier decisions. The resolution of the supply crisis came not from any sudden increase in logistical capacity, but from the forced acceptance of a slower operational tempo. The First Army, by mid-September, had settled into a pattern of limited advances punctuated by periods of consolidation that allowed supply lines to catch up. Divisions were rotated to rest areas more frequently. Training resumed as unit commanders recognized that holding in place provided the opportunity to integrate replacements and retrain soldiers to peak effectiveness. The frenetic pace of late August became the measured advance of autumn, still relentless but no longer dependent on superhuman efforts from supply personnel and truck drivers. This was not the outcome that anyone had wanted in the exhilaration of August. Yet it was the outcome that logistics demanded. The First Army had learned, at considerable cost to its morale and at the expense of victory in 1944, the immutable lesson that even the most powerful military machine is ultimately constrained by the ability to supply it. The broader implication of the supply crisis extended beyond the First Army to shape the entire trajectory of the war in Europe. The shortage of fuel in September would echo through the failures of September Market Garden, the airborne operation that Montgomery attempted with less support than it required. The restricted ammunition supply meant that the First Army could not concentrate firepower as effectively as doctrine demanded. The postponement of aggressive operations gave German forces the time they desperately needed to fortify their homeland defenses. While the First Army could not have achieved final victory through logistics alone, the constraint imposed by supply shortages meant that the window of opportunity that had briefly opened in August closed far too quickly. Historians would later debate whether a different logistical strategy, greater emphasis on supporting the First Army's advance over that of other armies, or a decision to halt the mechanical troops and commit greater resources to follow-on infantry exploitation, might have changed the war's outcome. Such debates were academic. What mattered was that by September 1944, the First Army had outrun its supply lines, and both the army and the war would pay the price for having come so far so fast. As autumn advanced, the soldiers of the First Army adapted to their new reality. The sense of imminent victory faded, replaced by the grim understanding that they would be fighting in this cold and damaged land for months yet to come. Equipment was maintained with new diligence because replacement parts could not be easily obtained. Rations were eaten with less complaint because everyone understood that they were eating what could be delivered across hundreds of kilometers of damaged roads. Training intensified because commanders knew that tactical skill and firepower coordination would matter more than momentum. The army had been tested by logistics as severely as it had been tested by German shells, and the soldiers emerged from that test with a new appreciation for the invisible machinery that kept them alive and fighting. The supply crisis of September 1944 had not broken the First Army, but it had transformed it from an army of exploitation into an army of siege, and that transformation would define everything that followed. The momentum that had carried the First Army across France in the weeks following the breakout from Saint-Lô began to falter as summer turned toward autumn in 1944. The rapid advances that had seemed almost inevitable in August, when American forces swept through Normandy and toward the German border at breathtaking speed, gave way to something far more grinding and unpredictable. General Courtney Hodges and his commanders discovered what generations of military strategists have learned through bitter experience, that the faster an army moves, the more dependent it becomes on fragile supply lines and favorable circumstance. By early September, the First Army had pushed so far beyond the ports of Normandy that gasoline shortages began to impose a harsh arithmetic on tactical ambitions. Trucks that had raced eastward now stood idle, their fuel tanks empty, while critical ammunition supplies piled up at depots hundreds of kilometers behind the front lines. The exhilaration of pursuit transformed into the frustration of standstill, and soldiers who had grown accustomed to dramatic territorial gains now faced the prospect of measured, costly advances, measured in single kilometers per day. The German military, meanwhile, had undergone its own transformation during these same weeks. Scattered and demoralized in the aftermath of the Falaise Pocket, where entire Wehrmacht armies had been encircled and destroyed, the German command structure nonetheless managed to reconstitute defensive positions along a line that stretched from the North Sea coast across Belgium and toward Switzerland. German engineers and surviving military commanders, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front where they had learned to construct formidable defensive works, began establishing a coordinated series of strongpoints and prepared positions. The West Wall, a pre-war German defensive fortification known as the Siegfried Line in Allied terminology, became a focal point for German defensive planning. Though partially dismantled and neglected during years of German offensive operations, portions of the West Wall still contained anti-tank obstacles, machine gun emplacements, and artillery positions that could be reactivated and strengthened. German troops, though reduced in number and exhausted from their long retreat, now had something they had lacked in August: prepared defensive terrain and a clear understanding that stopping the American advance was essential to any hope of prolonging German resistance. The weather itself became an antagonist as significant as any German division. By late September, the autumn rains began in earnest across northern France, Belgium, and western Germany, transforming roads into muddy channels and fields into quagmires. The bocage terrain that had frustrated American forces in Normandy gave way to open ground in some sectors, but the mud negated any advantage that terrain might have offered. Supply vehicles became mired, requiring extraordinary effort to extract and reposition. Soldiers found their uniforms perpetually damp, their weapons prone to jamming, their morale tested not only by German resistance but by the sheer physical misery of operating in conditions that transformed every kilometer of advance into an exhausting slog. Artillery pieces sank into soft earth, requiring engineers to construct elaborate corduroyed roads from timber and fascines just to maintain positions. The First Army's medical services were overwhelmed not only with combat casualties, but with men suffering from trench foot, pneumonia, and the cumulative effects of operating in a cold, wet environment without adequate shelter or relief. Against this backdrop of logistical constraint and deteriorating weather, Hodges and his corps commanders attempted to maintain offensive momentum, driven by strategic imperatives that seemed to demand continuous pressure on German forces. The objective remained the Rhine River, still more than 300 kilometers away by the most direct route. German forces, though weakened, still possessed considerable fighting capacity, particularly when defending prepared positions. The First Army's advances from September through November therefore developed a pattern that would characterize the entire autumn campaign: limited objective attacks that gained ground, measured in kilometers rather than tens of kilometers, followed by German counterattacks that were repulsed but not decisively defeated. The First Army's subordinate divisions, corps and regiments, found themselves fighting what has been aptly described as a war of attrition rather than maneuver. Young officers who had learned warfare through the rapid encirclements and dramatic breakthroughs of August now faced the prospect of frontal assaults against prepared positions, tactics that harked back to the First World War and stood in stark contrast to the mobile warfare they had learned in training. The human cost of this stalemate mounted steadily through the autumn months. American casualties in the First Army continued at elevated rates, not because of catastrophic defeats, but because of the grinding nature of continuous combat against an enemy that, though pushed back, refused to break. Replacement troops arriving in Europe were often green, lacking the cohesion and experience of the original invasion force, and they suffered disproportionately high casualty rates as they entered combat zones without adequate preparation. The officer corps, particularly at the regimental and company level, was gradually depleted by death and wounds. Many of the leaders who had proven themselves during the Normandy breakout were no longer present to guide their men through the autumn campaign. Their absence was felt acutely by units that relied on experienced judgment to navigate the tactical complexities of strong defensive positions. Soldiers who had enlisted in 1941 with the expectation of a short war found themselves by September 1944 contemplating the possibility that they might still be fighting when winter came, and perhaps beyond. Yet within the First Army there remained considerable tactical adaptability and a capacity for learning from experience. Divisional and corps commanders recognized that the days of rapid exploitation had passed and began organizing their forces and tactics accordingly. Artillery became increasingly central to the First Army's operational approach, with careful fire coordination used to neutralize German defensive positions before infantry assault. Hodges and his subordinates invested heavily in reconnaissance, in understanding German positions, in identifying weak points that could be exploited, rather than attacking prepared defenses head-on. The First Army began to develop what might be characterized as a methodical approach to breaking German defensive lines, recognizing that success would come through systematic reduction of enemy positions rather than dramatic breakthroughs. This adaptation was not without cost in terms of time and casualties, but it reflected a growing professional sophistication in the First Army's command structure. The terrain itself varied considerably across the First Army's operational zone during these autumn months, and commanders learned to use geography to their advantage. In September, following the Seine crossing, the First Army moved across relatively open terrain in the Île-de-France region east of Paris, where the world offered fewer natural defensive advantages. By October, as the army pushed northeast toward Belgium, the terrain became more complex, with river valleys, forests, and towns that could be defended. The town of Aachen, astride the Belgian-German border, and part of German territory since the First World War, became a focal point for the First Army's advance in early October. The assault on Aachen, which began on the 2nd of October and continued for nearly 10 days, exemplified the nature of autumn warfare: urban combat, high casualties, slow progress, and fierce German resistance in a town that the German military considered strategically important. The capture of Aachen represented a symbolic as well as tactical achievement, as it was the first significant German city to fall to the Allies, but the cost in American casualties and in the time consumed was considerable. The supply situation, which had driven much of the First Army's strategic frustration in September, showed signs of gradual improvement as September turned toward October. The port of Antwerp, captured by the British and Canadian armies to the north, was brought into operational status, shortening supply lines considerably. The logistical network that stretched back to Normandy and across the Channel began to function more efficiently, though never to the extent that commanders desired. Fuel arrived in more abundant quantities, though never in the quantities necessary for continuous mobile warfare at the pace some commanders wished to maintain. Ammunition supplies stabilized, allowing artillery to maintain more intensive fire support. These improvements were real but incremental, and the First Army never fully escaped the logistical constraints that had characterized the September crisis. The reality was that supporting more than 500,000 men in active combat operations across difficult terrain and in deteriorating weather posed problems that even the mobilized industrial capacity of the United States could not entirely overcome. As October progressed into November, the First Army became locked in what might best be described as attritional warfare across a broad front. German defensive lines, though not as formidable as the prepared fortifications along the west wall further east, were sufficiently strong and effectively commanded to exact a high price for American gains. The First Army's divisions found themselves committed to operations lasting weeks, with limited relief and no prospect of decisive breakthrough. The psychological impact of this transition from rapid success to grinding attrition cannot be understated. Men who had crossed France in weeks now moved forward in meters, at the cost of regular casualties. The expectation, widespread in the First Army in August and early September, that the war would be over by Christmas began to seem increasingly unrealistic as November arrived with no breakthrough in sight and snow beginning to fall in the higher elevations of the Ardennes and the Rhine Valley. The relationship between the First Army and the supply and logistics apparatus supporting it became increasingly complex as the autumn campaign progressed. Hodges found himself in constant negotiation with higher headquarters regarding the allocation of resources, the priority of supply shipments, and the feasibility of continuing offensive operations given logistical constraints. These negotiations were conducted at the highest levels of military command, involving not only Hodges and his immediate superior General Omar Bradley, but also Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. The fundamental tension was between the operational desire to maintain continuous pressure on German forces and the logistical reality that supporting such pressure required resources that were either unavailable or needed to be shifted from other operations. This tension, played out in headquarters far behind the front lines, had direct consequences for men in the mud and rain, fighting over villages and crossroads with no clear understanding of the larger strategic debates affecting their fates. By late November, as the first serious snow began to fall and the First Army settled into defensive positions across a broad front, it had become clear that the rapid exploitation phase of the European campaign had ended. The dream of reaching the Rhine before winter had proved illusory. German forces, though weakened and pushed back, had nonetheless managed to establish coherent defensive positions and had prevented the First Army from achieving the decisive breakthrough that Hodges and his commanders had sought. The First Army had advanced roughly 400 kilometers since the landing in Normandy in June, but the tempo of that advance had slowed dramatically from the heady days of August. The soldiers of the First Army, millions of them now, settled into winter positions and contemplated the reality that the war might not be over as quickly as they had hoped. German commanders, for their part, took note of the American stalling and began to contemplate whether a desperate offensive gamble, launched through the difficult terrain of the Ardennes in conditions that might limit American air superiority, might yet create an opportunity to regain the strategic initiative. The autumn of 1944 thus represents a crucial turning point in the history of the First Army and in the European campaign more broadly. The period of rapid exploitation that had characterized the weeks following the Falaise Pocket had given way to a grinding attritional struggle that would test not only the First Army's military capacity, but also the patience and morale of the men who comprised it. Logistical constraints, deteriorating weather, strengthened German defenses, and the sheer geographic distance to the final objectives combined to transform the character of the campaign from one of maneuver and breakthrough to one of systematic, methodical advance, measured in kilometers and accomplished at significant human cost. The First Army emerged from this autumn campaign both stronger and more tested, having learned the harsh lessons of maintaining an offensive against a determined enemy, defending prepared terrain in the worst possible weather conditions. The lessons learned in these months of grinding combat would serve the First Army well in the trials that still lay ahead, though none could have anticipated how soon those trials would arrive, or how desperate the fighting would become in the frozen world of the Ardennes forest, just weeks away. The autumn of 1944 had brought the First Army to a peculiar crossroads. After the rapid and triumphant sweep across France following the Falaise pocket, the soldiers and commanders of Hodges' force had settled into something between expectation and exhaustion. The German army, it seemed, was broken. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses in Normandy and the subsequent pursuit. Entire divisions had been annihilated or scattered. Yet as November dissolved into December, a curious stiffening of German resistance began to emerge along the borders of Belgium and Luxembourg. The Americans attributed it to the natural defensive advantages of terrain and shortened supply lines. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were merely consolidating their remaining forces along the Rhine. No one, from Hodges down to the privates in the foxholes, seriously contemplated that the enemy possessed the capacity or will to launch anything resembling a major offensive. That miscalculation would reshape the final months of the war in Europe. Behind the German lines, in the forests and valleys hidden from Allied observation, something extraordinary was taking shape. Adolf Hitler himself had conceived a desperate gamble, codenamed Operation Autumn Mist. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. A massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, a mountainous and heavily wooded region that stretched across Belgium and Luxembourg. German planners believed the terrain would negate American air superiority and conceal their preparations. The offensive aimed to smash through thinly held American positions, cross the Meuse River, and race westward toward the port of Antwerp. If successful, it would split the American and British armies, isolate General Bernard Montgomery's forces in the north, and potentially force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviet Union in the east. It was a strategy born from desperation, yet it possessed an internal logic that German commanders understood, even if they doubted its feasibility. Hitler had scraped together nearly 250,000 men, assembling them in forests and villages east of the Ardennes, hidden from prying Allied eyes and reconnaissance aircraft. The First Army's sector along the Ardennes was deliberately thin. General Hodges had stretched his divisions across a front of more than 120 kilometers, a dangerously overextended line for the force available to him. This was standard practice in a sector deemed quiet and defensive, but it reflected a fundamental assumption: nothing of significance would occur here. The 8 divisions assigned to hold the Ardennes had spent weeks in a state of low alert, rotating men back to rear areas for rest, conducting training exercises, and preparing for what everyone believed would be a winter stalemate, leading eventually to a spring campaign toward the Rhine. The weather was brutal. Snow had begun to fall in the Ardennes Plateau, and temperatures plummeted well below freezing. Supply lines struggled to keep pace with the men in the forward positions. Ammunition was adequate but not abundant. Fuel was rationed. Food often arrived cold or late. The men were tired. They were thinking about home, about rotation schedules that seemed impossibly far away, about the letters from families that arrived sporadically through the postal services. They were not thinking about attack. They were thinking about survival through winter. At precisely 0530 hours on the 16th of December 1944, the German army shattered that complacency in a catastrophic and unmissable way. German artillery began to roar across the Ardennes. The bombardment was intensive, coordinated, and devastating. More than 1,400 German guns opened fire simultaneously, pouring shells into American positions, command posts, supply depots, and the narrow roads where American reinforcements would need to move. The sky, in the pre-dawn darkness, lit up with muzzle flashes and explosions. Soldiers who had been sleeping in frozen foxholes or sheltering in farmhouses suddenly found themselves under assault from an intensity of fire they had not experienced since Normandy. Communications lines went down. Some American units lost contact with their higher commands in the first hours. Reports began flooding back to division and corps headquarters. German panzers were moving forward. Infantry in gray uniforms were attacking in waves through the snow and forest. This was not a raid or a probe. This was an offensive of massive scale. The Germans, everyone realized within minutes, were not defeated at all. The shock waves of the German offensive propagated rapidly upward through the chain of command. Corps commanders began receiving fragmented reports of attacks across their front. Division commanders scrambled to redirect reserves, to call back units that had been rotated to rear areas, to organize defensive positions that suddenly seemed inadequate. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group under which Hodges' First Army operated, was at his headquarters in Luxembourg when the offensive began. Initial reports were confused and contradictory, as they often are in the opening moments of massive military action, but within hours the magnitude became clear. German forces had achieved tactical surprise across a front of nearly 100 kilometers. In some sectors, American units were overrun. In others, they managed to form defensive perimeters and hold against repeated German attacks. The strategic situation was genuinely dangerous. If the Germans could maintain momentum and push westward rapidly enough, they could in fact threaten to split the Allied armies and create a catastrophic American defeat. Courtney Hodges did not hesitate. By the middle of the 16th of December, he had already begun making critical decisions that would shape the First Army's response to the offensive. He recognized immediately that he could not fight this battle alone. The German attack extended across the boundary between his First Army and General William Simpson's Ninth Army to the north. To the south, General George Patton's Third Army was out of immediate position to support. Hodges established contact with Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, with Eisenhower and his staff. The decision was made swiftly. The First Army would assume primary responsibility for defending against the Ardennes offensive and blunting the German advance, while reinforcements from other commands would be redirected to support the battle. Hodges' task was to prevent German breakthrough, to reorganize his scattered forces, and to buy time for reserves to arrive and stabilize the front. It was a terrible responsibility. The First Army, stretched thin and caught off guard, would have to hold against a determined and numerically strong German assault while maintaining cohesion and preventing panic. What followed was a series of decisions and actions that saved the American position and ultimately turned German ambition into German disaster. Hodges began redirecting divisions from the First Army's southern sector, units that had been in reserve or conducting training. These formations were ordered northward to reinforce the crumbling defense and to establish new defensive lines in the path of the German advance. The Fifth Corps, commanded by General Leonard Garrow, was already heavily engaged in the center of the attack and immediately began organizing defensive perimeters. The Eighth Corps, under General Troy Middleton, which had borne the brunt of the initial German assault, retreated in some sectors but held firm in others, slowing the German advance in critical areas. Hodges also coordinated with Eisenhower to bring additional reinforcements from outside his army group. Patton's Third Army was wheeled northward to attack the German spearhead from the south, creating a converging threat that prevented German forces from exploiting their initial breakthrough. The logistics operation required to sustain this response, to move divisions across winter roads while maintaining supply lines and communication, was itself a military achievement of considerable significance. Trucks and trains moved through the night carrying ammunition, fuel, food, and reinforcements. Engineers worked to keep roads open despite snow and ice and German air attacks. Supply clerks and quartermasters coordinated with field commanders to ensure that the defensive effort would not collapse due to lack of ammunition or fuel. The German assault, for all its initial success and surprise, began to lose momentum almost immediately. The American Army's capacity to absorb shock and reorganize was demonstrating itself once again. In the northern sector, the German 6th Panzer Army, commanded by General Josef Dietrich, found its advance slowed by determined American defense around key towns and crossroads. Around St. Vith and Bastogne, American units dug in and fought with desperate courage. The town of Bastogne, a key communication hub, became the focus of intense German effort. The 101st Airborne Division, hastily airlifted into the battle, arrived to find the town under threat. The paratroops organized the defense of Bastogne with remarkable speed and determination. German forces surrounded the town, cutting off its garrison from outside supply and reinforcement. Yet despite being encircled and under constant attack, the paratroopers and the supporting American forces held. When German commanders demanded surrender, the American general in command of the Bastogne garrison, Anthony McAuliffe, delivered a response that became legendary. The word was no, expressed in language that made clear the depths of American resolve. That refusal and the successful defense of Bastogne became a turning point in the psychological dimension of the battle. Hodges coordinated these defensive operations with precision and resolve. He was not a flamboyant commander in the manner of Patton, nor did he seek the spotlight. But in crisis, he demonstrated the qualities that had brought him to command of the First Army: calm judgment, the ability to process complex information rapidly, and confidence in his subordinates. He held his command post in Luxembourg and maintained constant communication with his corps commanders. He listened to reports, asked incisive questions, and made decisions. When his chief of staff expressed concern about the possibility of German breakthrough in a particular sector, Hodges calmly analyzed the situation and redirected forces accordingly. When supply officers warned that ammunition reserves might not sustain the defensive effort, Hodges coordinated with higher headquarters to bring in additional supplies. He also understood something crucial that many senior officers grasped only slowly. The battle was not lost in the opening hours or days. As long as the First Army held key terrain, prevented German breakthrough, and maintained internal cohesion, time was working in favor of the Americans. German forces, no matter how strong initially, would lose momentum as American reserves arrived and as the weather eventually improved, allowing air power to again dominate the battlefield. The days following the initial German assault were among the most challenging of the entire European campaign. The First Army was fighting in deep snow and extreme cold. Soldiers suffered from frostbite and exhaustion. German forces launched repeated attacks against American positions, seeking to break through. In some locations, small American units were surrounded or cut off, and those men fought with knowledge that relief was uncertain, and surrender was often not an option against the most fanatical German units. Yet the First Army's defensive line, while bent and pressed, did not break. The line held. Divisions that had been scattered in the opening hours reformed and counterattacked. Supply lines, despite German efforts to disrupt them through air attacks and infiltration, continued to function. Reinforcements continued to arrive. By the 18th of December, just 2 days after the initial assault, the First Army began to shift from pure defense to the coordination of counterattacks designed not merely to hold, but to push back. Patton's Third Army, swinging northward, began attacking the southern flank of the German salient. The tempo of the battle remained intense, but the German initiative, the element of surprise, the momentum of the opening assault, all had dissipated. The German army would continue to assault American positions for weeks. The Battle of the Bulge, as it came to be known, would persist through January of 1945 and would demand far more of the First Army than just the opening phase. Soldiers would continue to suffer and die. The weather would remain brutal. Supply difficulties would persist. But the crisis of breakthrough, the danger of genuine strategic disaster, had passed within days. Hodges and the First Army had absorbed a massive shock and had refused to break. The German offensives, no matter how violent and determined, would gradually lose strength as American forces reorganized and counterattacked. The Ardennes offensive, despite being the largest German offensive in the West since the invasion of France, would ultimately fail. It would cost Germany irreplaceable men and armor that could never be replaced. It would accelerate the decline of the Wehrmacht and bring the final defeat of Nazi Germany measurably closer. And it would be remembered as one of the First Army's finest hours, not because of brilliant offensive maneuver or rapid breakthrough, but because of the stubborn, unshakable refusal to accept defeat in the face of overwhelming initial shock, and the capacity to reorganize and counterattack when circumstances seemed most desperate. The winter of 1944 arrived, with a severity that few soldiers had anticipated. Snow fell heavy across the Ardennes forest, where the First Army held a stretched and thinly manned line that stretched northward from Luxembourg through Belgium toward the Dutch border. General Courtney Hodges had positioned his force across terrain that seemed, in retrospect, almost indefensible. The divisions under his command had been engaged in continuous operations for months, and many units were below strength, their ranks depleted by casualties that replacements could not fully replenish. Yet there was a quality of cautious optimism in the American camps during those early December days. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces, though stubborn, lacked the capacity to mount anything more than local counterattacks. The autumn stalemate had convinced many commanders that the Germans were fighting a last-ditch defensive war, not preparing for a massive offensive thrust. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. On the 16th of December 1944, the assumption collapsed into chaos. Before dawn, more than 200,000 German soldiers, supported by approximately 1,300 tanks and assault guns, burst across the Belgian frontier in an offensive operation codenamed Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Germans had concentrated their forces with a secrecy that penetrated American lines without detection, and the sheer scale of the assault caught the First Army in a moment of profound vulnerability. Artillery barrages opened the assault, pounding American positions across a broad front stretching more than 100 kilometers. German panzer divisions, the spearhead of the offensive, pushed westward with the objective of reaching the Belgian port city of Antwerp, which they hoped would sever the supply lines of British and American forces in northern Europe. The initial German assault fell most heavily on the First Army's weakest point, the Valle Corps, commanded by General Troy Middleton, which held a section of the line with barely more than 80,000 men spread across an impossible distance. The shock of the German assault was total and disorienting. American soldiers, many of them seeing combat for the first time, faced an enemy that had appeared from nowhere and was advancing with overwhelming force and coordination that seemed impossible, given what intelligence had suggested about German capabilities. Hodges received the first reports of the German offensive at his command post, and the magnitude of the crisis became apparent within hours. The Valle Corps was collapsing under the weight of the German assault, and panicked reports from the front spoke of German tanks advancing without effective opposition and American units being overrun or forced into retreat. For a moment, the outcome hung in terrible balance. The Germans had achieved surprise, concentrated strength, and the momentum of a desperate, all-or-nothing offensive. The First Army faced the prospect of being split, with German forces potentially driving a wedge between American and British armies and reaching the objectives that Hitler had promised would change the course of the war. Yet Hodges, despite the shock of the moment, maintained the clarity of mind that marked the best commanders under pressure. He immediately directed the movement of divisions northward to block the German advance, even as he coordinated with other Allied commanders to organize a response. The First Army's artillery units, positioned behind the initial German breakthrough, began to concentrate their fire on the advancing columns, slowing the German momentum even when the infantry lines could not hold. Engineers began demolishing bridges and creating obstacles to impede the rapid movement of German panzers. The initial chaos began to settle into organized resistance. The first 72 hours of the Battle of the Bulge became a desperate race between German momentum and American resilience. The Germans pushed forward with speed and coordination, but they encountered American units that, despite being shocked and outgunned, refused to collapse into panic. At places like Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division found itself surrounded but maintained a perimeter against sustained German assault, American soldiers demonstrated a capacity for stubborn defense under impossible circumstances. The 200th Division, which had been positioned in the line with minimal combat experience, absorbed the initial German assault and, though forced backward, inflicted casualties that slowed the German advance. Every bridge destroyed by American engineers, every road blocked by American soldiers determined to hold, every anti-tank gun that managed to destroy a German panzer, all of these small acts of resistance accumulated into a force that prevented the German breakthrough from achieving the speed and depth that the offensive required. The Germans, who had planned to reach Antwerp in weeks and split the Allied armies, found themselves fighting for every kilometer of advance against an enemy that had recovered from shock and was organizing methodical, devastating resistance. Hodges coordinated with Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower and with General Bernard Montgomery, the British commander whose forces were positioned to the north of the German offensive. The command structure of the Allied forces underwent reorganization as Montgomery, who had the authority over the northern sector of the front, received operational command of the American First Army and the Ninth Army on the northern flank of the German Bulge. This arrangement, though tactically necessary, created tension between American commanders who chafed under British operational control and Montgomery, who was accustomed to methodical planning and conservative advances. Yet despite the political friction, the coordination that emerged was effective. Montgomery organized the defense of the northern shoulder of the Bulge, preventing German forces from achieving breakthrough in that sector. Hodges, working now under Montgomery's operational direction, coordinated the organization of the southern response. The two commanders, though different in temperament and approach, shared a common objective: prevent German success and organize the counteroffensive that would drive German forces back in defeat. American divisions, many of them still engaged in combat during the initial German assault, were redirected northward with a speed that seemed almost reckless. Supply lines that had been stretched across hundreds of kilometers were reorganized to support the defensive concentration. The American capacity to shift enormous forces rapidly across extended distances proved to be one of the decisive advantages that German planners had underestimated. As Christmas 1944 approached, the nature of the battle began to shift from desperate defense toward organized counterattack. The German offensive, despite initial successes, had failed to achieve its primary objective of rapid breakthrough and encirclement. The Germans had created a bulge in the American lines, hence the name by which the battle would be remembered, but they had not achieved the strategic breakthrough that Hitler had demanded. American resistance had hardened along multiple axes. The weather, which had grounded American aircraft in the days after the German assault, improved, and once the cloud cover broke, American air superiority became overwhelming. German columns were attacked constantly by American fighter bombers and medium bombers. German reinforcements and supply columns suffered devastating losses. The Luftwaffe, attempting to contest American air superiority, found itself facing American fighter pilots who were experienced, well-equipped, and numerically dominant. By the end of December, German air opposition had diminished to negligible levels. This aerial dominance, which the Germans had possessed in the early days of the war, but had long since lost, proved absolutely critical to limiting the scope and success of the German ground offensive. The German forces, concentrated and moving forward, became targets of a magnitude that no amount of tactical surprise could overcome. The First Army, reinforced and reorganized, began its counteroffensive in the early days of 1945. The initial German assault had pushed the American lines back roughly 80 kilometers at the deepest point of the German advance, creating the bulge from which the battle took its name. Pushing the Germans back across that same distance required coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The First Army, attacking from the south, drove northward against German forces that were attempting to maintain their positions and continue their exploitation. American commanders coordinated these attacks carefully, pushing forward while maintaining flanking security and supply lines. The pace of the American counteroffensive accelerated as German resistance, though fierce in many places, became progressively less organized and less supplied. German units that had advanced with confidence on the 16th of December found themselves, by early January, fighting for survival, surrounded by American forces attacking from multiple directions with complete air superiority. The German soldiers, who had been told that American resistance had collapsed and that the offensive would quickly reach its objectives, found themselves instead in a grinding, attritional combat situation where they were outnumbered and running short of fuel, ammunition, and supplies. By the final week of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was reaching its conclusion. The German salient had been squeezed from north and south until it disappeared. German forces that had advanced with such confidence in December were in full retreat, leaving behind thousands of prisoners and vast quantities of destroyed or abandoned equipment. The human cost of the battle was staggering on both sides. The Germans suffered more than 100,000 casualties killed, wounded, or captured during the offensive and its aftermath. The First Army and other American formations had suffered nearly 80,000 casualties, with the American Expeditionary Force as a whole sustaining more than 110,000 casualties during the entire period of the offensive and the counteroffensive that followed. For the soldiers of the First Army, the Battle of the Bulge represented the most intense combat experience many would face during the entire war. The initial shock of the German offensive, the desperate defense, and the grinding counteroffensive that followed consumed men and resources in a battle that, despite its ultimate American success, felt more like a grinding attrition than the swift victory that commanders had anticipated in early December. Yet the significance of the Battle of the Bulge extended beyond the immediate military engagement. The battle represented the last major German offensive of the war, the moment when Nazi leadership attempted to achieve through military force what they could no longer achieve through diplomacy or strategic surprise. The failure of the offensive meant that the Germans had exhausted their capacity for offensive operations. Remaining German forces were committed to defense and defense alone. The initiative in the war, which had rested with American and Allied forces since the Normandy landings, had been briefly contested by the German offensive, but the outcome had demonstrated conclusively that American forces possessed the capacity to recover from shock, to coordinate effective responses, and to defeat German armies despite tactical disadvantages at the point of initial contact. The American soldiers who fought in the Bulge, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division who held Bastogne against encirclement, the 202nd Division soldiers who absorbed the initial German assault, the tank crews of the 3rd Armored Division who drove northward in winter conditions to relieve surrounded forces, the artillery crews who poured fire on German columns advancing through narrow valleys. All of these men had demonstrated a quality of resilience and determination that would define American military effectiveness in the final months of the war in Europe. The relationship between Hodges and Montgomery, forged in the pressure of the Battle of the Bulge, reflected the broader American-British alliance that had become central to the Allied war effort. Montgomery, though demanding and sometimes difficult, possessed genuine tactical skill and an understanding of the importance of coordinated operations. Hodges, though he had chafed initially at British operational command, demonstrated flexibility and a willingness to subordinate his preferences to the larger objective of defeating the German offensive. The tension between the two commanders reflected deeper differences between American and British military culture. American commanders favored aggressive, rapid maneuver operations. British commanders preferred methodical planning and concentrated force. Yet the battle demonstrated that, despite these differences, the two nations' military leadership could coordinate effectively under pressure. The headquarters staffs of the First Army worked closely with British staff officers. Supply lines were coordinated across national boundaries. Air support was allocated according to strategic priorities rather than national interest. This capacity for effective coordination, forged in the crisis of the Bulge, would prove essential in the final phase of the war against Nazi Germany. By February 1945, the First Army had stabilized its lines and was preparing for the next phase of the campaign. The Germans, their offensive shattered and their capacity for sustained military operations exhausted, had retreated back across the Belgian and German borders. The First Army had suffered grievous casualties and had been pushed backward, then had pushed forward again, all within a span of roughly 6 weeks. Yet the outcome was decisive. The Germans had attempted to change the course of the war through military force and had failed. The American soldiers who had held key positions, defended against overwhelming force, and then driven the Germans back in counterattack, had demonstrated that the Third Reich's capacity to achieve victory had expired. The Battle of the Bulge was the beginning of the end, not of the American war effort, but of Nazi Germany itself. In the months that followed, the First Army would push eastward across the Rhine and into central Germany, meeting Soviet forces and bringing the war in Europe to its conclusion. The soldiers who had fought in the Bulge carried with them the knowledge that they had survived the German army's last great offensive, had turned the crisis of that offensive into a military disaster for their enemy, and had proven that American military might, properly coordinated and effectively led, could overcome any challenge that Nazi Germany could place in its path. The winter of 1945 brought no respite to the men of the First Army. The Battle of the Bulge had shattered the myth of German collapse, but it had also shattered German reserves. As February arrived with gray skies and frozen ground, General Courtney Hodges understood a fundamental truth. The Third Reich was dying, but it would not die quietly. The First Army now faced the task of driving through the flooded, scarred world of Western Germany, pushing toward a river that had stopped armies for centuries. That river was the Rhine, and it represented the final threshold before Nazi Germany could be invaded from the west. Every kilometer gained would bring the First Army closer to victory, but every kilometer would also bring them deeper into German territory, where fanatical resistance still awaited. The men had learned in the Ardennes that complacency was suicide. They would advance now with hard eyes and harder discipline. The terrain itself became an adversary as significant as any Wehrmacht unit. The Rhine floodplain stretched across western Germany like a vast, waterlogged barrier. Heavy winter rains had swollen the rivers and streams that fed into the Rhine system, transforming roads into ribbons of mud and creating marshes where none had existed in autumn. Tanks bogged down in the mire, requiring constant effort to extract and reposition. Supply trucks slid sideways on icy surfaces, their cargo precious and irreplaceable. Infantry moved through cold water up to their knees, their uniforms soaked, their morale tested not by bullets, but by exhaustion and the gnawing cold that never fully released its grip. The First Army's engineers worked ceaselessly to improve roads and construct temporary bridges, knowing that every hour of delay meant German defenders had more time to dig in along the Rhine's western bank. Pontoon bridges were laid across swollen rivers. Corduroy roads were built through swamps where vehicles had sunk to their axles. The engineering effort was as crucial to victory as any infantry assault. Without it, the First Army would have stalled entirely, trapped in the mud of Germany's western plain. German resistance, though fragmented, remained tactically formidable. The Wehrmacht no longer possessed the reserves to launch grand offensives like the Ardennes counterattack, but what remained of German military organization had retreated to defensive positions that made maximum use of terrain and natural obstacles. German commanders had fallen back to the Rhine, knowing that the river itself provided an almost perfect defensive barrier. They established strongpoints in the scattered towns that dotted the floodplain, converted buildings into bunkers, and interlocked fields of fire so that every approach was covered. German artillery, though reduced in quantity, was deployed with precision honed by years of warfare. Counter-battery fire from First Army artillery had reduced German gun positions significantly, but enough remained to punish hasty American advances. Infantry units of the Wehrmacht, many of them experienced veterans pulled from other fronts or reformed from units decimated in the Ardennes, fought with a grim determination born from knowledge that their homeland was now the battlefield. They knew they were losing, but defeat in place was preferable to the SS tribunals that awaited deserters. The First Army's soldiers could feel the enemy's desperation. It made them both more dangerous and, paradoxically, more predictable. General Hodges faced a strategic and tactical dilemma that tested his organizational genius. The First Army's advance had consumed enormous quantities of ammunition, fuel, and food. Supply lines that stretched back through Belgium and France were stretched thin, and winter weather made supply operations unpredictable at best, impossible at worst. Hodges had to decide whether to maintain maximum pressure on the enemy or to consolidate his gains, reorganize his logistics, and prepare for the next phase. The Supreme Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, was pushing for speed. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly from the east, and the Americans wanted to reach the Rhine before the Soviets crossed their own objectives in Poland and Central Europe. However, speed without adequate supply was merely a road to encirclement and disaster. Hodges resolved the dilemma by accepting a measured pace, fast enough to maintain pressure, but slow enough to ensure that supply lines could keep pace. Corps commanders were given clear orders: advance aggressively, but don't run beyond the supply trains. Artillery would be used freely to destroy German positions before infantry assaults. Ammunition was available in abundance, though fuel was rationed strictly. Every division received clear objectives and stop lines. The First Army would not bleed itself dry in a reckless dash to the Rhine. The experience gained through months of campaigning now shaped American tactics. The First Army's soldiers and officers had learned brutal lessons about German defensive tactics, the effectiveness of combined arms in difficult terrain, and the necessity of coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. Divisions attacking German-held towns now followed a standard drill. Artillery would be massed to suppress German defenses. Fighter bombers would strafe enemy positions if weather permitted. Tanks would move forward to draw German anti-tank fire and suppress it, and only then would infantry assault prepared positions with maximum firepower support. Losses still occurred, sometimes horrifically, but the American way of war, exchanging material and firepower for casualties when possible, was proving effective. German tactical doctrine, born from 2 decades of mobile warfare and blitzkrieg, was less effective in static defense, and the Americans exploited this ruthlessly. Tank warfare in the mud and narrow roads of Western Germany favored American tactics of mass and firepower over German tactics of maneuver and precision. The First Army's tankers and infantrymen worked together with a familiarity born from shared hardship and repeated success. They trusted each other's capabilities and compensated for each other's weaknesses. The crossing of the Elbe River in late February became a tactical proving ground for the approach to the Rhine. The Elbe, a tributary that flowed north toward the Rhine, had been flooded by German engineers who had destroyed the dams upstream, creating a temporary barrier that delayed American advances by several weeks. Once the water levels receded enough to allow bridging operations, First Army engineers moved forward with assault boats and pontoon sections. The crossing itself was conducted under fire. German defenders on the far bank attempted to disrupt the operation with artillery and machine gun fire. American infantry, now veterans of amphibious and river crossing operations, conducted the assault with precision and courage. Engineers died laying pontoon bridges while machine gun fire searched the river surface. Soldiers crossed in assault boats while mortar rounds threw up spray around them. Some boats were struck and sank. Some men drowned in the cold current while their comrades shouted encouragement. But the beachhead held, expanded, and within hours the first full regiments were across the Elbe, pushing inland and securing the far bank. The successful crossing of the Elbe demonstrated that American river crossing doctrine and equipment had been refined through hard experience. The Rhine, when it came, would be a much larger undertaking, but the experience would be invaluable. The German command structure was crumbling even as German soldiers fought with discipline and courage. Rivalries between Nazi Party authorities and Wehrmacht officers had intensified as defeat became inevitable. Supply lines were collapsing. Fuel for German vehicles was nearly impossible to obtain, limiting German mobility to almost nothing. German air support had virtually ceased. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable force, was now reduced to occasional appearances by desperate pilots flying increasingly obsolete aircraft. Communication between German formations was disrupted by American radio jamming and the physical destruction of telephone lines and radio stations. Higher command simply could not coordinate effectively anymore, and local commanders fought almost in isolation, making decisions based on incomplete information and dwindling resources. This fragmentation worked entirely to the First Army's advantage. Instead of facing a cohesive defense, Hodges faced scattered, disconnected units that could be defeated in detail. German tactical skill could not compensate for German strategic collapse. The First Army's intelligence officers understood this. Reconnaissance patrols pushed forward aggressively, feeling for weak points in the German line, probing for opportunities to exploit. Every patrol that returned with information about German dispositions and strengths was one more piece of the tactical puzzle that allowed American commanders to attack where Germans were weakest. The relationship between General Hodges and his subordinate commanders had matured into something approaching perfect understanding. Corps commanders like General John Anderson and General Matthew Ridgway knew Hodges's thinking and anticipated his orders. Division commanders understood their corps commanders' intentions without needing lengthy explanations. This command cohesion had been forged through months of fighting together, through victories and reversals, through moments of triumph and moments of horror. When Hodges issued orders for the advance toward the Rhine, he was not dictating movements to commanders he barely knew. He was coordinating the efforts of men who understood his philosophy of war and shared his commitment to achieving victory while preserving American lives whenever possible. Orders flowed smoothly through the chain of command. Junior officers understood not just what was expected, but why. This clarity of purpose, this shared understanding of the mission and the means to achieve it, made the First Army an instrument of extraordinary effectiveness. Germans facing American units in February and March of 1945 were not facing disorganized masses, but highly trained and coordinated formations, operating under commanders who understood each other's capabilities and limitations intimately. The civilian experience of the American advance was one of confusion and fear, mixed with hope and curiosity. German civilians caught in the path of the First Army's advance had lived under total war for years. Bombing had destroyed their towns, propaganda had poisoned their understanding of the Americans, and fear of Soviet revenge made American capture seem almost merciful by comparison. Some civilians fled before American troops, others hid in cellars and waited. When American soldiers entered German towns, they were often surprised to encounter civilians waving white flags, or simply standing in the streets, watching with expressions that mixed defeat with something approaching relief. American soldiers, for their part, had been briefed extensively about German responsibility for Nazi atrocities, but the civilians they encountered in Western Germany often seemed ordinary, even pathetic. The cognitive dissonance between enemy and civilian blurred in the chaos of advancing warfare. Soldiers provided rations to hungry children. Officers established order and relative safety in captured towns. This interaction between conquerors and conquered, this first experience of American occupation, set patterns that would intensify in the final months of the war. The First Army was not just destroying the Wehrmacht, it was becoming an army of occupation, beginning to impose American order on a shattered German society. As March arrived, the Rhine came into view. First Army reconnaissance units pushed forward across the final German defensive lines, breaching them with a combination of firepower and maneuver that was now second nature to veteran American units. The geography of the Rhine basin began to reveal itself. The river itself, perhaps 400 meters wide in most places, flowed north toward the Netherlands, its current strong and its banks steep. The Germans had destroyed every major bridge. The American Army Corps of Engineers would have to construct new ones, or cross on assault boats and temporary pontoons. German troops dug in on the far bank, knowing that they could not defeat the Americans but believing they might delay them. German artillery was positioned to cover likely crossing sites. Anti-tank guns were placed to stop American armor from establishing bridgeheads. Machine gun positions were sited to sweep the river surface. The Germans had learned something from months of American assaults. They could not stop the Americans, but they might slow them, impose casualties, and buy time for whatever final stand might be organized further east. The First Army's soldiers understood that the Rhine crossing would be the final major obstacle before moving into the industrial heartland of Germany and, ultimately, linking up with Soviet forces somewhere in the vast flatness of Central Europe. Every man knew the war was nearly over. They also knew that soldiers often died in the final days of warfare, sometimes in the largest numbers of all. The supply situation improved marginally as the First Army prepared for the Rhine crossing operation. The capture of German airfields allowed American aircraft to operate from forward bases, reducing the distance fuel had to be transported. The opening of the port of Antwerp to American use provided a new supply point far forward in newly liberated Belgium. Railway lines, captured intact in some cases, were being repaired and brought back into operation under American control. The First Army now had more ammunition, more fuel, and more food than it had enjoyed since leaving France. Hodges ensured that reserves were accumulated for the Rhine crossing. He knew that once First Army units were on the far bank, they would be dependent on successful supply operations across whatever bridges American engineers could construct. There would be no margin for error, no possibility of running out of ammunition or fuel during the crossing itself. Intelligence about German dispositions on the far bank was as precise as American reconnaissance could make it. Air reconnaissance, ground patrols, and prisoner interrogation all contributed to a detailed picture of German defensive preparations. When the First Army finally moved to execute the Rhine crossing, it would do so with overwhelming local advantage in firepower, with clear knowledge of German defensive positions, and with confidence born from months of successful operations against a weakening enemy. The Rhine stood as the final barrier, a river that symbolized the end of one era and the beginning of another. For Nazi Germany, the Rhine had always represented the boundary between the Reich and the outside world, the line that should never be crossed by an enemy, that the Americans were now preparing to cross it, within sight of German soil, represented the complete reversal of German fortune. General Hodges understood the symbolic as well as the military significance of the Rhine. His soldiers understood it as well, perhaps even more acutely. They had fought across France and Belgium, they had survived the shock of the Ardennes, they had pushed through winter mud and German resistance to reach this point. The Rhine crossing would be the final major test before Germany's unconditional surrender. The First Army had proven its worth through months of sustained combat. Now it would prove its capability to execute the most complex military operation yet attempted in Europe. A major river crossing against a defending enemy, the establishment of a secure bridgehead, and the rapid exploitation of that bridgehead into German territory. Everything the First Army had learned, every sacrifice made by its soldiers, every lesson written in blood and mud and snow, would now be applied to cross the Rhine and complete the destruction of the Third Reich. By early March 1945, the First Army stood at the threshold of Nazi Germany's final collapse. General Courtney Hodges and his commanders understood that one more barrier remained before them, the Rhine River, the greatest natural obstacle in Western Europe, and the last meaningful defensive line the Wehrmacht could muster. The river itself was formidable, more than 300 meters wide in many places, swift-flowing and cold, its eastern bank dominated by German artillery positions and hastily prepared fortifications. The Rhine was not merely a tactical problem, it was the final test of American will and capability. On the western bank, Hodges assembled the resources of the First Army with meticulous precision. Engineers conducted reconnaissance operations at night, identifying crossing sites where the current was manageable and German defenses were weakest. Supply depots swelled with ammunition, fuel, and bridging materials, pontoons, assault boats, floating platforms, and thousands of meters of cable and steel. The magnitude of what was being prepared was staggering. Not one crossing, but multiple operations along a broad front, each coordinated to overwhelm German defenses through sheer concentration of force and speed. Behind the river lines, German commanders faced a crisis they could neither solve nor escape. Their forces had been battered across the Ardennes and driven back through winter mud and cold. Reinforcements that might have fortified the Rhine never arrived. Panzer divisions were committed to futile counterattacks, infantry regiments were decimated, and command structures had fractured under the weight of continuous defeat. The German Army Group B, facing Hodges, was a shroud of its former self, outnumbered, outgunned, and increasingly unable to conduct coordinated operations. Hitler's demands for fanatical resistance only widened the gulf between orders and reality on the ground. What remained was desperation rather than coherent strategy. The assault on the Rhine began in darkness, as the First Army's crossing operations commenced on multiple fronts in the second week of March. The main effort came at Remagen, where American forces had already seized an intact bridge in a stunning coup, allowing the first substantial penetration of German territory east of the river. But Hodges was not content with Remagen alone. He ordered simultaneous crossings farther north and south, designed to overwhelm German defenders by presenting them with multiple crises simultaneously. The night itself became an instrument of war. American artillery, massed on the western bank in unprecedented density, opened a bombardment that illuminated the sky and shattered the darkness with concussive waves of sound. More than 3,000 guns fired in coordinated patterns, their shells raining down on German positions, bunkers, and approach roads, creating a cacophony of destruction that German defenders remembered for the rest of their lives. Engineers directing the crossing operations moved with practiced urgency, guiding assault boats and pontoon rafts into the water under this protective umbrella of firepower. The boat crews, young soldiers, many still teenagers, rowed against the current while shells whistled overhead and German return fire splashed into the water around them. The darkness made the crossing both more terrifying and more survivable. German gunners could not see their targets clearly, and American casualties, while substantial, were far lower than a daylight crossing would have inflicted. The assault infantry of the First Army, the men who had fought through France and endured the winter, pressed forward into the boats with the resignation of soldiers who understood that the next few hours would determine whether they lived or died. Some boats reached the far shore and discharged their passengers. Others were struck by German artillery or machine gun fire and went down in the cold water, spilling men into the current. Those who made it ashore moved quickly to establish security, clearing embankments and fortified positions, while engineers and supporting troops poured across in increasing numbers. The engineering effort was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Rhine crossing. While assault infantry secured beachheads on the eastern bank, American engineer battalions performed the almost miraculous task of constructing floating bridges under fire. The pontoon bridges were assembled with staggering speed, sometimes under 3 hours from first placement to completion, using materials that had been staged across the German frontier. The logistics behind this achievement was itself a triumph of American industrial and organizational capability. Thousands of tons of bridging equipment had been transported across hundreds of kilometers from the supply depots of France, stockpiled near the Rhine, and positioned for rapid deployment. Engineers worked in teams, their actions choreographed through months of training and rehearsal. They connected pontoon sections while under artillery fire, navigated the swift current that threatened to sweep them downstream, and maintained focus despite the chaos of battle surrounding them. Some engineer units suffered devastating casualties. Entire squads lost to direct hits from German shells, yet others emerged relatively unscathed, their survival a matter of chance and timing as much as skill. The bridges, once completed, became lifelines. Trucks loaded with ammunition and supplies rumbled across them in steady streams, their drivers hunched over their wheels, knowing that German artillery observers were watching and waiting. Tanks roared across on suspended tracks, their weight creating ponderous lines of vehicles stretching back toward the western bank. The spectacle of thousands of tons of materiel crossing in organized fashion was testimony to American logistical mastery and the sacrifice of men who maintained these crossings under constant threat. German resistance on the eastern bank grew fiercer as the First Army established its foothold. Wehrmacht units committed reserves to counterattacks aimed at pushing American forces back into the river before beachheads could be reinforced and consolidated. What had been a river crossing threatened to become a confused melee as German infantry, supported by the last available German armor, attacked American positions with desperation. But the First Army's defensive firepower was overwhelming. Artillery support continued without let-up, pouring fire on German assembly areas and counterattack routes. American infantry, now dug in along the eastern bank, held prepared positions and repulsed the German assaults with disciplined volleys of rifle and machine gun fire. The German armor, what little remained operational, was swiftly destroyed by American anti-tank guns and tank fire. The counterattacks failed within hours, leaving the German lines broken and their ability to conduct organized operations in shreds. By the end of the third day of crossing operations, more than 100,000 American soldiers stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine, supported by hundreds of tanks, thousands of trucks, and the entire apparatus of American military logistics. The German efforts to contain the crossing had consumed what remained of their combat reserves. There would be no more coordinated counteroffensives, no more organized defensive lines, only the slow withdrawal of broken units toward the interior of Germany. The significance of the Rhine crossing extended far beyond the tactical victory of securing beachheads. The Rhine had been presented to German civilians and military personnel as the last bastion of German defense, the final geographic barrier that would shield the homeland from invasion. Its breach was psychologically catastrophic for German morale. Soldiers watching the endless streams of American soldiers and equipment pouring across the river understood that defeat was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. Officers received orders that became increasingly divorced from reality, demanding that units hold positions that no longer existed or move toward objectives that could not be reached. The command structure of the German army in the West was dissolving into fragments. General Courtney Hodges recognized this moment of German collapse and adapted his operations accordingly. Rather than permitting his commanders to pause for consolidation, he ordered continued exploitation of the bridgehead. Engineers worked frantically to expand the crossing sites, creating additional bridges and pushing further supplies and troops across the river. Hodges directed his corps commanders to push mobile forces eastward with maximum speed, racing to prevent the German armies from reorganizing behind defensive lines or achieving any kind of coherent withdrawal. The First Army, no longer constrained by the Rhine, began to